Get ready to be transported into the unknown. Welcome back to W-broux, your ultimate escape into chilling tales from the darkest corners of reality. If you're joining us for the first time or you're a returning listener, make sure to hit that subscribe button because here, the fear never sleeps. Before we dive into tonight's spine-tingling story, I want to know, where are you listening from? Drop your location in the comments below. Are you tuning in from a dark bedroom, a long night drive, or maybe somewhere even more mysterious? Also, make sure to like the video if you're ready to embrace the darkness with me tonight. Your support keeps the nightmares coming. Story 1, The Watcher in the Window. Alex had just moved into his new apartment, hoping for a fresh start. It was a small but cozy place, perched above the busy streets below. The building, though old, had charm. Its creaky floors and faded wallpaper told stories of the past, but Alex wasn't interested in the past. He wanted to leave his behind. The first few nights were peaceful. Alex unpacked, arranged his furniture, and began exploring his new neighborhood, filled with quirky cafes, little shops, and friendly faces. Everything seemed perfect, almost too perfect. But on the third night, something changed. Alex was sitting on the couch, sipping tea, and scrolling through his phone when his gaze wandered to the window. Across the street stood another building, nearly identical to his own. And there, in the window of the apartment directly opposite, stood a woman. Her skin was ghostly pale, her dark hair falling messily around her shoulders. She stood motionless, her hollow eyes staring straight at him. At first, Alex thought it was just a coincidence. Maybe she had looked out at the exact moment he had. But her eyes never moved. She didn't blink. She just stared. Feeling a sudden chill, Alex pulled the curtain shut, dismissing the encounter as nothing more than a strange coincidence. But later that night, as he lay in bed, he couldn't shake the image of the woman's vacant eyes. He peeked out from the corner of his window once more. She was still there, in the same position, staring. Alex's heart pounded. Trying to convince himself that it was all in his head, he shut the curtain tighter and turned off the lights, though sleep did not come easily. The next evening, Alex decided to distract himself with a movie, hoping to forget the unsettling encounter. But when the credits rolled, he couldn't resist a quick glance at the window. Serena was there again, unblinking, her expression as empty as before. It felt as if her gaze pierced through the glass, invading his private space. What was she doing? Why was she always there? Over the next few days, this strange pattern continued. Every night, without fail, Serena appeared in the window, always watching. Sometimes she stood perfectly still, and other times she paced back and forth, her vacant eyes never leaving Alex's apartment. Each time he saw her, the sense of dread grew heavier, gnawing at his nerves. One restless night, curiosity got the better of him. He grabbed his jacket and stepped outside, hoping a walk would clear his head. As he strolled down the street, he couldn't help but glance up at her building. The window was dark, no sign of her pale figure. Maybe she was finally gone. But back in his apartment, as he sank into his couch, the unsettling weight remained. He stared at the window, waiting for her to appear, and as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the streets in a golden glow, she returned. This time Alex didn't close the curtain. He couldn't. He felt drawn to her, compelled to understand why she was watching him. She wore the same loose white dress that fluttered slightly in the evening breeze, her eyes as hollow as ever. And then she did something she hadn't done before. She raised her hand and pointed directly at him. Alex's breath caught in his throat. Panic surged through him as he stumbled backward, pulling the curtain shut with a sharp yank. What did she want? Was she trying to communicate? His mind raced with possibilities, none of them comforting. The next day, Alex debated whether to call the building manager or the police. But what could he say? A woman was staring at him. No crime in that. Besides, she hadn't done anything. Yet. But that night, when Serena appeared once more, her gaze felt different, more intense, more invasive. It wasn't just a harmless stare. It felt personal. And this time, Alex couldn't just sit by and let it happen. He had to know who she was. Determined, he grabbed his keys and left his apartment, crossing the street to the building opposite. His heart raced as he stood at the entrance, staring up at the dark windows. Was he making a mistake? Taking a deep breath, Alex climbed the stairs to the floor where he had seen her, feeling a mix of dread and determination. As he reached her door, he hesitated, his hand hovering over the doorknob. What if she wasn't who he thought she was? What if this was all just in his head? He knocked. No answer. He knocked again, louder this time. Just as he was about to turn back, he heard a faint creak. The door opened slowly, revealing Serena, her pale figure silhouetted against the dim light inside. She didn't speak, didn't change her expression. She just stood there, staring at him, her eyes as empty as before. "Please," Alex stammered, his voice trembling. "Can you stop watching me?" She didn't respond. Her gaze remained fixed on him, cold and distant. Then, just like the night before, she raised her hand. But this time, she wasn't pointing at him. She gestured behind her, as if beckoning him to come closer. Alex froze, fear coursing through his veins. He wanted to run, to get as far away from this building as possible. But something held him there, an inexplicable pull. He took a cautious step forward, peering into the dimly lit apartment. The room was empty, completely empty. No furniture, no decorations, just bare walls and a floor coated in dust. It didn't make sense. How could she live here? Suddenly, the window that she always stood in front of slammed shut, the sound echoing through the quiet building. Alex stumbled back, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't wait for an explanation. He turned and ran down the stairs, not stopping until he was back in the safety of his own apartment. But even as he locked the door behind him, the feeling of being watched remained. That night, Alex barely slept. Every sound in his apartment seemed amplified by his fear. The creak of the floorboards, the distant hum of traffic, the ticking of the clock, it all felt like it was building towards something. And then, in the silence of the night, he heard it, a soft tapping. It wasn't coming from the window across the street. It was coming from inside his apartment. Alex's blood ran cold. He slowly turned, his eyes scanning the room. The tapping grew louder, more frantic. It was coming from the bathroom. Summoning all his courage, Alex approached the door, his heart racing. He pushed it open, expecting to find nothing but the empty room. But as he entered, the tapping stopped. The bathroom was dark, the shadows stretching ominously across the walls. He glanced toward the mirror and froze. There, in the reflection, he saw a flicker of movement. Before he could react, something darted out of view, disappearing behind the shower curtain. Panic surged through Alex as he yanked the curtain aside, but there was nothing, just the empty tub. He backed away, his mind reeling. Then the tapping started again, louder this time. But now, it wasn't just in the bathroom. It was all around him, echoing through the apartment like a warning. Alex didn't wait to find out what would happen next. He grabbed his keys, threw open the door, and ran out into the night, leaving behind the haunting presence that had plagued him since he moved in. As he stood on the street, gasping for breath, He looked up at the window where Serena had always stood. Her silhouette was still there, watching him leave. Her empty eyes locked onto him one final time. Story 2: The Hidden Box. Lucas stood alone in his late mother's house, the silence so thick he could almost hear his own heartbeat. Sorting through her belongings felt like an impossible task. Each item carried the weight of memories he wasn't ready to face. Her presence lingered in every corner of the house, like a whisper that refused to fade. Every photograph, every piece of jewelry, every dusty book on the shelf seemed to echo with the essence of a life now gone. As Lucas rummaged through her bedroom closet, something unusual caught his eye: small, ornate wooden box tucked away behind a stack of old sweaters. It was different from the other things in the closet, almost as if it were intentionally hidden. The box was beautifully carved, its surface etched with intricate floral patterns that seemed to dance under the dim light. It had a tiny keyhole, but the key was nowhere to be found. Curiosity sparked within him as he took the box downstairs and placed it on the dining table, surrounded by the remnants of his mother's life, her favorite books, old letters, trinkets, and the photos that he hadn't yet dared to sort through. The box seemed to stand out from everything else, as though it were guarding secrets she had never wanted to share. Days turned into weeks, and Lucas continued to sort through the endless piles of his mother's belongings, but his mind kept drifting back to the box. He searched every drawer, every pocket of her coats, and every little nook in the house for the key, but it was nowhere to be found. The box became an obsession, a puzzle that gnawed at him night and day. One cold evening, after a particularly exhausting day of sifting through the past, Lucas decided he could no longer wait. If his mother had hidden something this well, it must have been important, something that could change everything he thought he knew about her. With trembling hands, he grabbed a small screwdriver and began to work on the lock. It took a few tense moments, but finally, with a soft click, the lock gave way. He slowly opened the lid, and the box revealed its secrets. The inside was lined with deep crimson velvet, and the contents lay nestled like relics from another time: old photographs, yellowed letters tied together with a fraying ribbon, and a small envelope sealed with wax. Lucas's breath hitched as he gently lifted the first photograph. The photograph was faded and creased, but he could make out a family: a man, a woman, and 2 children standing in front of an old farmhouse. Their faces were solemn, their eyes staring into the camera with a mixture of sadness and defiance. The boy in the photo looked oddly familiar, his eyes piercing and dark. Lucas turned the photograph over and saw a name scrawled on the back: James. A sense of unease settled over Lucas as he stared at the name. He had never heard of a James in his family before. His mother had never mentioned a brother, let alone one with such a haunting presence. Who was this James, and why had his mother kept him a secret? He put the photograph down and reached for the letters, his hands shaking slightly as he untied the ribbon. The first letter was addressed to someone named Eleanor, and the handwriting was unmistakably his mother's. Elegant but shaky, as though written in moments of great distress. Lucas's eyes scanned the words, and with each line his heart sank deeper into his chest. Eleanor, the letter began, "I don't know how to go on after what happened. The fire took so much from us, but losing James, losing my little brother, was the hardest. I can't forgive myself for not being able to save him." Lucas read the words over and over, each one like a blade twisting in his chest. His mother had a brother she had lost in a tragic fire. He continued to read through the letters, each one revealing more of the pain and guilt that had consumed his mother's life. "I see his face in my dreams," she wrote in another letter. "His eyes full of fear, begging me to save him. But I couldn't. I failed him. Eleanor, and now I must live with that failure every single day. Lucas's mind raced as he tried to piece together the fragments of this story. His mother had carried the weight of this tragedy in silence, never once letting him see the scars that marred her soul. Why had she hidden this from him? What else hadn't she told him about her life, about their family? The final letter was the most heartbreaking of all. It was dated just months before his mother's death, and her words seemed to bleed from the page. "I fear that the past is coming back to haunt me," she wrote. "I hear whispers in the night, and I can't shake the feeling that James is still here, watching, waiting for me to find him. I have to make this right, Eleanor. I have to find a way to let him go." Tears welled up in Lucas's eyes as he imagined the torment his mother must have endured all those years. He felt as though he had just uncovered a side of her he was never meant to see, a side filled with regret, sorrow, and a desperate need for redemption. The woman he thought he knew had hidden a lifetime of pain behind a mask of strength and resilience. Lucas reached for the small, wax-sealed envelope, his hands trembling. He hesitated for a moment, feeling the weight of its significance, before finally breaking the seal. Inside was a single piece of paper, its edges yellowed with age. The note was short but powerful, a final confession from his mother to Eleanor. "Dear Eleanor," it read, "If you're reading this, then I am no longer here. I've tried to protect my family from the truth, but I can't hide it any longer. James's spirit still lingers, trapped by my guilt, by my inability to save him. I hope one day you will understand why I kept this from you. I did it out of love, to shield you from the darkness that has followed me all these years." Lucas sat back, the letter trembling in his grasp. His mother's words were a raw and unfiltered look into her soul, a soul that had been haunted by a past she couldn't let go. As he read the final lines, he felt an overwhelming sense of sadness, but also a newfound determination. His mother had spent her life trying to protect him from the darkness of her past, but now that he knew the truth, he couldn't turn away. Over the next few weeks, Lucas made it his mission to uncover more about his family's history. He reached out to distant relatives he had never met, digging through old family records and piecing together the fragments of his mother's life that had remained hidden for so long. What he discovered was a story of tragedy, resilience, and a family torn apart by a single night of horror. The fire that took James's life had been a devastating event, one that had shattered his mother's world. But there were also whispers of another story, a story of redemption, of unfinished business that stretched beyond the grave. The more Lucas learned about James, the more he realized that his mother's guilt had kept her tethered to the past, unable to move on. Lucas felt a deep connection to James, a brother he never knew existed, but who was now a part of him in ways he never imagined. He vowed to honor his memory by telling his story, by shedding light on the darkness that had consumed his mother's soul. He realized that the hidden box wasn't just a repository of secrets, it was a doorway into a history that had shaped his entire life, even if he hadn't known it. As Lucas closed the lid on the box, he knew his journey was far from over. He had uncovered the truth about his family's past, but there was still so much more to understand, so much more to heal. His mother's legacy was one of love and sacrifice, a story of a woman who had carried the weight of her guilt to protect her son. And now, it was his turn to carry that legacy forward, to ensure that neither his mother nor James would ever be forgotten. The hidden box had opened a door to a past that was both heartbreaking and beautiful, a past that Lucas was now determined to explore. He felt a renewed sense of purpose, a desire to connect the pieces of his family's history, and to finally bring peace to the ghosts of their past. He knew now that every story, even the painful ones, contributes to who we are. And as Lucas stood in the quiet of his mother's old house, he whispered a promise to her memory he would carry her legacy forward, not just in the things he found in that hidden box, but in the love and resilience she had always shown him. Story 3: The Flip Phone Uncovering a Sinister Secret. On a quiet Saturday afternoon, Ethan strolled through a neighborhood garage sale. He loved these weekend hunts, seeking out hidden treasures among the clutter. The air was filled with the scent of freshly cut grass and the hum of people chatting excitedly as they browsed through old books, vintage trinkets, and dusty antiques. As he sifted through a box labeled electronics, something unusual caught his eye: a small, unassuming flip phone. The phone looked like a relic from the past, its silver casing slightly worn but still intact. Its presence felt out of place, almost as if it were waiting for him to discover it. Curiosity got the better of him, and after a brief negotiation with the seller, Ethan bought the flip phone for a few dollars. He slipped it into his pocket and continued on his way, not knowing that this small purchase would lead him down a path he could never have imagined. Later that evening, Ethan sat at his kitchen table, the flip phone resting in front of him. He powered it on, surprised to see the screen flicker to life with its retro glow. After a moment, a prompt appeared on the screen, asking for a password. Intrigued, Ethan tried a few obvious combinations: -1234, 000000, his birth year, until on the third attempt, the screen unlocked. He was greeted with a main menu that looked surprisingly bare. Except for one folder that caught his eye, videos, Ethan's heart skipped a beat as he clicked on the folder. Inside, there were dozens of video files, each labeled with a date and time. The most recent one was dated just 2 days ago. Ethan hesitated, a knot of unease twisting in his stomach. He pressed play, and the small screen filled with grainy footage. His breath hitched when he realized what he was looking at. It was a video of his own apartment, taken from an angle that suggested someone had been watching him through the window. The realization that someone had been secretly filming him sent a chill down his spine. The video showed Ethan in his living room, going about his evening routine, cooking dinner, flipping through TV channels, and finally settling down with a book. He stared at the screen in disbelief. Who could have recorded this, and why? How long had they been watching him without his knowledge? Ethan's fingers trembled as he clicked on the next video. This one showed him walking through the park with friends, laughing under the sunlight. He remembered that day clearly, the warmth of the sun on his skin, the joy of being surrounded by people he cared about. But the knowledge that someone had been there, lurking in the background, capturing his every move without his consent, twisted that memory into something dark and sinister. He quickly played another video. This time the footage was taken in a coffee shop. Ethan was sitting alone, lost in thought, his face reflecting moments of quiet contemplation. The camera had zoomed in on him, capturing the most intimate expressions: the smiles, the frowns, the fleeting moments of vulnerability that he thought were private. Panic began to set in as Ethan realized he was being stalked. The videos weren't just random moments, they were a detailed record of his daily life, captured by someone who knew exactly where he would be and when. He felt his privacy crumble away, piece by piece, replaced by a growing sense of fear. Determined to get to the bottom of this nightmare, Ethan scrolled further back in the video archive. The earliest video was dated over a year ago. It showed him walking home late at night, the streets deserted except for a few distant shadows. In the video, Ethan seemed unaware of the camera, his movements casual, almost relaxed. But in the background, just out of focus, was a man standing in the shadows, watching him. Ethan's mind raced. He remembered that night of vague unease, a sensation that he was being followed. though he dismissed it at the time as paranoia. Seeing the video now, he realized that his instincts had been right. Someone had been tracking his every move for over a year. As he continued to watch, he noticed that the videos weren't just a collection of random moments. They were organized, methodical. Whoever was behind the camera had been systematically recording his life, cataloging his routines, studying his habits. But why? What did they want? Just then, the screen of the flip phone went black, and a single message appeared. "You shouldn't have found this." Ethan's blood ran cold. The simple message felt like a direct threat, a warning that he had crossed the line he wasn't supposed to. He slammed the phone shut, his breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. The room around him seemed to close in, the walls pressing tighter as the reality of his situation sank in. In a desperate attempt to regain control, Ethan decided to take the phone to the police. He grabbed his coat, shoved the phone into his pocket, and raced out the door. As he walked through the quiet streets, his eyes darted to every shadow, every passerby. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him, tracking his every step. At the police station, he explained his situation to the officer on duty, showing them the phone and the videos. At first, the officer seemed skeptical, but as Ethan played the footage, the expression on the officer's face shifted from doubt to concern. They promised to investigate, taking the phone into evidence. For the next few days, Ethan tried to go back to his normal life, but the sense of unease never left him. Every time he walked down the street, he felt eyes on him. Every glance from a stranger filled him with dread. The places that had once felt safe and familiar now seemed sinister, filled with hidden threats. Then, one evening, just as he was beginning to believe that maybe the worst was over, Ethan received a call from the police. They had tracked down the source of the videos. The man who had been recording them had been arrested for harassment and stalking. He had been using the flip phone to record Ethan and several other people, following their movements, tracking their lives like some twisted game. Relief washed over Ethan, but it was quickly replaced by a lingering sense of violation. Even though the stalker was behind bars, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. He felt exposed, vulnerable in ways he never had before. The videos had taken something from him, a sense of security that he could never fully reclaim. Ethan decided he couldn't let fear dictate his life. He enrolled in self-defense classes, determined to reclaim his sense of control and power. He formed a close-knit group of friends who always had his back, who supported him through the worst of his fears. The flip phone, once a symbol of his terror, became a catalyst for change, pushing him to take charge of his own narrative. He knew the memories of those videos would never fade completely. They would always be there, in the back of his mind, a reminder of how fragile his privacy had once been. But they also served as a testament to his resilience, his determination to fight back against the shadows that had tried to consume him. As Ethan walked through the streets of his neighborhood, he held his head a little higher. He was no longer just a passive observer in his own life, but an active participant, ready to face whatever came his way. The fear that had once controlled him was now a fire that fueled his courage. And though he would never forget the fear of that first night when he found the flip phone, he knew that he had come out stronger on the other side. The watcher who had once held him captive in their gaze was now behind bars, and Ethan was free to live his life on his own terms. He had taken back the power that had been stolen from him, and he vowed to never let it go again. Ethan still kept the flip phone, locked away in a drawer in his bedroom. Not as a reminder of the fear, but as a symbol of his strength. The small, unassuming device that had once been a harbinger of dread was now a token of his journey, a journey from victim to victor. And though he was no longer haunted by the shadow in the window, he was forever changed by the experience. He had learned that sometimes the scariest monsters aren't the ones hiding in the dark, they're the ones watching from the corner of your eye, waiting for you to see them. Story 4: The Traveler, a haunting encounter at dusk. It was a crisp Tuesday afternoon, and Liam was sitting on his porch, savoring the cool breeze while sipping a glass of iced tea. The late autumn sun cast long shadows across the quiet street, painting the landscape in shades of gold and amber. It was one of those rare moments of peace that Liam cherished, a moment to forget the worries of daily life and lose himself in the tranquility of his small town. Just as he was about to lean back and close his eyes, Liam noticed a figure in the distance, slowly approaching on the winding road just outside his neighborhood. The figure appeared to be a traveler, hunched under the weight of a heavy backpack, their steps slow and uneven. The closer they came, the more Liam could see their clothes worn but surprisingly clean, like they had been on the road for a while but still managed to take care of themselves. As the traveler drew nearer, their eyes locked with Liam's. A relieved expression spread across their face, and they quickened their pace, heading straight for his porch. Liam's sense of calm shifted to mild unease, but he reminded himself that his mother had always taught him to be kind to strangers. Offering a hand to those in need was second nature to him. "Excuse me," the traveler said, their voice hoarse but polite. "Could you help me? I'm trying to find Elm Street." Of course, Liam replied, forcing a smile to hide his discomfort. He gave the traveler detailed directions, explaining each turn and landmark clearly. As he spoke, the traveler nodded attentively, even jotting down the directions on a small piece of paper. "Thank you so much," the traveler said, a broad smile lighting up their face. "I appreciate your kindness." Liam watched as the traveler turned to leave, but as they did, a strange chill ran down his spine. Something about the way they smiled, it was too wide, too fixed, like it was hiding something else. He shook off the feeling and called after them, "Be careful out there. The roads can be tricky." The traveler waved back, their smile never wavering, and continued down the road. Liam tried to brush off the encounter, convincing himself that it was nothing more than his imagination playing tricks on him. That night, as the shadows deepened and the temperature dropped, Liam locked his doors and got ready for bed. Just as he was drifting off to sleep, a soft knock echoed through the quiet house. He froze for a moment, listening. The knock came again, louder this time. Liam hesitated but eventually opened the door, expecting to see a neighbor or maybe a late-night delivery. Instead, there stood the traveler from earlier, still wearing the heavy backpack, and with that same unsettling smile plastered on their face. "Hello again," they said, their voice almost too cheerful. "I followed your directions perfectly." Liam blinked, taken aback. "Oh, I didn't expect you back so soon. Did you find Elm Street?" "Not quite," the traveler replied, stepping inside without an invitation. "But I was hoping to thank you properly for your help." A knot formed in Liam's stomach as the traveler closed the door behind them, shutting out the cool night air. The grin on their face seemed even broader now, almost predatory. You really don't have to do that," Liam said, taking a step back. The air in the room seemed to grow colder, and a strange electric tension filled the space between them. "But I want to," the traveler insisted, their eyes gleaming with something dark and unreadable. "Gratitude is important, don't you think? It's essential to repay kindness in full." As the traveler spoke, Liam felt an unsettling energy emanate from them, a heaviness that seemed to press down on his chest. He forced a nervous laugh, trying to keep his voice steady. I think it's getting pretty late. Maybe we should continue this conversation another time. Late, the traveler repeated, their hollow laugh echoing in the quiet room. The night is just beginning. I couldn't dream of leaving without showing you my appreciation. Before Liam could respond, the traveler reached into their backpack and pulled out a small object, wrapped in a piece of tattered cloth. They unwrapped it slowly, revealing a beautifully carved wooden figure that glistened under the dim light. The figure looked ancient, almost sacred, its details intricate and unsettling. "This is a gift," the traveler said, holding out the figure to Liam. "A token of gratitude for your kindness." Liam's instincts screamed at him to refuse, to back away, but he felt a strange compulsion to take the figure. It was as if the object itself held some kind of power over him. He reached out hesitantly, his fingers brushing against the smooth wood, and the moment he touched it, a shiver coursed through his entire body. The traveler's eyes seemed to darken, their smile turning into something more sinister, something that made Liam's blood run cold. "You see," they whispered, their voice low and conspiratorial, "this isn't just a gift. It's a connection, a bond between us." Liam pulled his hand back, the figure feeling heavier than it should have. "I appreciate the gesture," he said, his voice shaking slightly, "but I really can't accept this. I think you should go now." The traveler's expression faltered for the briefest moment before the grin returned, wider than ever. "You don't understand," they said, their tone almost mocking. "We're connected now, aren't we? You opened your door to me, you invited me in." A sharp metallic smell filled the air, like the scent of rusted iron or old blood, and Liam felt his stomach twist in terror. He took a step back, his hand reaching for the nearest wall to steady himself. "Please," he said, barely above a whisper, "you need to leave. Now." "Leave?" the traveler echoed, their laughter now full and echoing, like the toll of a distant bell. "Why would I leave when we've only just begun?" Desperate, Liam forced a calm smile and said, "Fine. Let me just grab my coat before we go any further." "I'll be right back," he turned quickly, making his way toward the kitchen where his phone lay on the counter, just out of reach. As he moved, the traveler's eyes never left him. They watched his every step, their expression never faltering. Just as Liam reached for the phone, he felt a cold hand grip his shoulder. He turned sharply to find the traveler standing impossibly close, their breath cool against his face. "Who are you calling?" they asked, amusement dripping from their voice. Liam's heart pounded in his chest as he gripped the phone tighter, his fingers dialing the emergency number. "Help. There's someone in my house," Liam whispered urgently into the phone, keeping his eyes locked on the traveler. "They won't leave, and I think I'm in danger." The operator's calm voice was barely audible over the roaring sound of his own heartbeat. They assured him that help was on the way, but as the traveler took another step forward, Liam could see that they knew. They knew help was coming, and they weren't afraid. "Why fight it?" the traveler said, their voice now a harsh whisper. "You invited me in. You asked for my help." A sudden burst of sirens filled the air outside, their wailing cutting through the tension like a knife. For the briefest moment, the traveler's grin faltered, replaced by a flash of irritation. Seizing his chance, Liam darted past them and flung the front door open, rushing outside into the cold night air. The police cars pulled up to his driveway, their lights casting red and blue flashes across his house. Officers stepped out, and Liam ran towards them, his voice breaking with relief as he shouted, "There's someone in there, in my house. Please help." The officers moved quickly, guns drawn, as they entered Liam's home. For several agonizing minutes, there was silence. Then they emerged, shaking their heads in confusion. "There's no one inside," one of them said. "Are you sure you saw someone?" Liam stared at them, his mind reeling. How could they not find the traveler? How could they have disappeared without a trace? He was sure they had been there. He had felt their touch, smelled their breath, seen their smile. "You don't understand," Liam said, his voice trembling. "They were here. They're real. I swear it." The officer gave him a sympathetic look and said, "We'll patrol the area, but it's possible you just imagined it. Maybe a trick of the light or stress." He didn't believe it himself as he said it, but Liam knew what he had seen, knew what he had felt. As the police cars pulled away, Liam stood alone on his porch, staring into the dark night. The chill of the evening air did nothing to calm the icy fear that gripped his heart. Just as he turned to go back inside, he glanced at the window and froze. There in the glass reflection was the traveler's face, smiling back at him from the darkness of his own home. And in that moment, Liam knew the truth: they were still inside. They had never left. They were waiting for him, watching him, their eyes filled with that same haunting smile. Story 5: The Unseen Presence When a Home Becomes a Stranger. Lena had always loved living alone in her cozy little house on the outskirts of town. It was a small, quiet place where she could enjoy her independence, surrounded by a garden that she tended with care. For years, everything seemed perfectly ordinary until the day the small, unexplainable things started happening. At first, it was just little things. A pair of socks disappeared from her laundry basket, only to turn up days later in the strangest of places. Her favorite mug, a chipped piece of pottery she'd bought from a local market, went missing from the kitchen cabinet. She brushed it off as simple forgetfulness. After all, who didn't misplace items now and then? But as the days turned into weeks, Lena began to notice that these small incidents were becoming more frequent and unsettling. One morning, she was getting ready for work when she reached for her favorite jacket, a warm, blue coat that always hung by the front door. Only it wasn't there. Frowning, she checked the hall closet, then the living room, but it was gone. In its place, hanging where the jacket should have been, was an old scarf that Lena hadn't seen in years. Her keys, which she always left on the hook by the door, had been moved to the kitchen counter, neatly placed next to a small plant. She stared at them, the knot of unease in her stomach tightening. Trying to shake off her growing anxiety, Lena convinced herself that it was just her mind playing tricks on her. Maybe she was stressed, working too much, not getting enough sleep. She told herself it was nothing, just one of those things that happen when you lived alone. But deep down, she knew there was something more to it, something that didn't make sense. That evening, as she returned home from a long day at work, Lena stepped into the living room and immediately noticed something was off. A framed photo of her late grandmother, which usually sat proudly on the mantel, was now lying on the coffee table, facing the couch. The glass was slightly smudged, and the frame looked like it had been moved with care. Lena's heart raced. She was certain she hadn't touched that photo in weeks. It was one of her most cherished possessions, something she kept exactly where it belonged. She reached out to pick it up, her fingers trembling as they brushed against the cold surface of the frame. "Did I move this?" she whispered to herself, her voice shaky in the empty room. The question hung in the air, unanswered. The next morning, determined to get to the bottom of these strange occurrences, Lena took a mental inventory of her belongings. She walked through each room, making note of where everything was, hoping to catch whatever it was that was causing these disturbances. She was meticulous, ensuring every book, every piece of furniture, every decoration was exactly where it should be. But despite her best efforts, the disturbances continued. A few days later, Lena found a light switch in the hallway flipped off when she was sure she had left it on. The small, inexplicable chill that had settled over her house now felt like a full-blown storm brewing inside her mind. Every day, another small thing seemed to shift. Another piece of her life felt like it was being rearranged by unseen hands. Over dinner with a friend one evening, Lena finally voiced her concerns. "I think there's something weird going on in my house," she said, trying to keep her tone light but failing to mask her unease. "Little things keep moving. Items disappear and then turn up in the strangest places." Her friend laughed it off, waving a dismissive hand. "You're just stressed, Lena. You've been working a lot. When you're tired, the mind plays tricks on you, that's all. Don't worry about it." But Lena couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than just stress. She knew herself she wasn't imagining things. That night, after her friend had left, she made a decision. She needed proof, something tangible to show that these occurrences weren't just in her head. Lena set up a camera in the living room, pointing it directly at the mantel where her grandmother's photo had been moved. She felt a strange mix of fear and excitement as she clicked the record button, the small red light of the camera casting an eerie glow in the darkened room. She knew that whatever was happening, she was going to catch it. The next morning, as she reviewed the footage, her hands shook. For the first few hours, nothing happened. The room remained still, undisturbed. Just as she was about to switch off the recording, a shadow flickered across the screen. It was so quick, so subtle, that she almost missed it. She replayed the footage, squinting at the screen, her heart racing. Moments later, she saw it, a small movement, almost imperceptible. But there, the photo of her grandmother slid from the mantel and landed softly on the table below. There was no visible force, no one in the room, just the quiet, eerie movement of the picture as it seemed to shift on its own. Lena's breath hitched in her throat. She rewound the footage again and again, watching as the impossible unfolded before her eyes. There was no wind, no drafts, nothing that could explain what she had just witnessed. It was as if an invisible hand had reached out and gently moved the frame. Desperate for more answers, Lena set up a second camera in the hallway, this time aimed at the light switch that had inexplicably turned off the other night. She went to bed that evening with a sense of dread gnawing at her, the feeling that her home was no longer her own. In the middle of the night, Lena was jolted awake by a faint sound, a soft shuffling, almost like footsteps, coming from the hallway. Her heart pounded in her chest as she lay still, straining to listen. She reached for her phone and, with trembling hands, began to review the footage from the hallway camera. As the video played, her blood turned to ice. There at the edge of the frame was a figure, faint and barely visible, but moving with a slow, deliberate grace. It was a silhouette, shifting through the darkness, its shape distorted as if the air around it was warping. Lena watched in horror as the figure approached the light switch, reaching out a shadowy hand to flip it off. She couldn't tear her eyes away from the screen. Her mind raced with questions: who or what was in her house? Was it a spirit, a ghost, something else entirely? And why was it targeting her? She felt like her world had turned upside down, like everything she once thought she knew was now unraveling before her. Unable to bear the suspense any longer, Lena decided she had to confront whatever was in her house. The following evening, she prepared for her showdown. She lit candles in the living room, the flickering flames casting long, eerie shadows across the walls. She placed a chair in the center of the room and sat down, her eyes fixed on the darkness. "Is anyone here?" Lena called out, her voice echoing slightly in the quiet house. "If you're here, show yourself. I'm not afraid." The silence was deafening, pressing in on her like a thick fog. Just when she was about to give up, a sudden gust of cold air swept through the room, extinguishing one of the candles. Lena's skin prickled with goosebumps as she felt the temperature drop around her. "Show yourself," she demanded, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and defiance. "I just want to understand." The air seemed to grow even colder, and for a brief moment, Lena thought she saw something, a shadow, a figure, just at the edge of her vision. It was there 1 second and gone the next, like a trick of the light. But she knew she hadn't imagined it. And then, a whisper. Soft, almost fragile, like the rustling of leaves in the wind. "Help me," the voice said, barely audible but clear enough to send a shiver down her spine. Lena's heart raced, her breath coming in short gasps. This wasn't just a haunting, it was a plea for help. She took a deep breath, leaning into her fear, letting it ground her. "What do you need?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Tell me what you need." The answer came not in words, but in a rush of memories that flooded her mind. Images of a past life, intertwined with glimpses of her own, filled her vision. She saw fragments of joy and sorrow, fleeting moments of laughter, and the agony of loss. She felt a connection forming, an energy that linked her to this spirit, a presence that was neither malevolent nor benign, but trapped, seeking peace. The items moving in her house, the calls for help, it wasn't an attack. It was a cry for resolution, for release from a burden too heavy to carry alone. Lena's fear began to melt into empathy, a deep understanding of what this presence needed. "I'll help you," Lena said softly, tears welling in her eyes. "I'll help you find peace." As she spoke those words, the air around her seemed to shift. The room felt warmer, lighter, as if a great weight had been lifted. The shadows that once loomed over her seemed to soften, retreating back into the corners of her home. She knew then that she had made a promise, one she was determined to keep. From that night on, Lena's house returned to its quiet, peaceful state. The disturbances ceased, and the unseen presence that once haunted her seemed to fade. But she never forgot the lesson she had learned, that even the most unsettling encounters could lead to compassion, that even in darkness, there is a chance to heal. And though her home was once again her own, Lena felt it was forever changed, marked by the presence of a spirit that had reached out not to harm, but to be understood. She would never forget the whispers in the shadows, the plea for help from the unseen presence that had once shared her home. Story 6: The Shadow in the Mirror, a glimpse beyond reality. Emma always believed that her small apartment was her sanctuary, a place where she could relax, shut out the world, and be at peace with her thoughts. She lived alone, which suited her just fine, enjoying the solitude that came with a quiet life. But her sense of safety began to unravel the day she bought the antique mirror. She had found the mirror at a flea market on a Saturday afternoon. It was large, ornate, with a beautifully carved frame that seemed to shimmer in the sunlight. The vendor had smiled mysteriously when she asked about its origins, saying only that it was an old piece with a history. Intrigued by its vintage charm, Emma decided it would look perfect on the wall of her living room. As she hung the mirror in its new place, she admired the way it seemed to brighten up the room, reflecting light in a way that made the space feel larger. For the first few days, the mirror was nothing more than a beautiful addition to her home, and she often found herself glancing at it as she moved through her daily routine. But then, things started to change. One night, as she was brushing her hair in front of the mirror, she noticed something odd. Out of the corner of her eye, she thought she saw a shadow moving behind her, a quick, fleeting shape that disappeared the moment she turned to look directly at it. Emma froze, Her eyes locked on the reflection, but the shadow was gone. She laughed nervously, chalking it up to her imagination, or maybe the trick of the dim light. Over the next few days, however, the strange occurrences grew more frequent. Every time she stood in front of the mirror, she caught glimpses of that shadow, a vague, human-like shape lingering just at the edge of her vision. It never moved when she looked directly at it. It only seemed to exist in that blurred space between her focus and her peripheral sight. Emma's unease turned to dread one evening when she was getting ready for bed. She paused in front of the mirror to apply her night cream, her reflection calm and familiar. But as she glanced down for just a second, she saw the shadow standing right behind her, clearer than ever before. It wasn't just a shape this time, it had depth, a form that seemed almost human. Her breath caught in her throat as the shadow's face turned slightly towards her, its features undefined but somehow knowing. Emma spun around, her heart pounding, but there was nothing there, just the empty room and the soft glow of her bedside lamp. She turned back to the mirror, and her own frightened face stared back at her. The shadow was gone, but this time she was sure it wasn't her imagination. She had seen it, felt its presence, as if it were reaching out to her from the other side of the glass. Desperate to understand what was happening, Emma decided to investigate the history of the mirror. She returned to the flea market the next weekend, hoping to find the vendor who had sold it to her. But the market was different that day, more crowded, noisier, and despite searching every stall, she couldn't find him. It was as if he had vanished without a trace, taking with him the answers she needed. Frustrated, Emma did some research online, diving into forums about haunted objects and paranormal experiences. She discovered that mirrors have often been associated with supernatural phenomena, portals to other realms, gateways for spirits trapped between worlds. The thought chilled her to the bone, but it also gave her a strange sense of clarity. She wasn't losing her mind. There was something in that mirror, something that shouldn't be there. That night, determined to confront whatever was haunting her reflection, Emma set up her phone to record the mirror while she slept. She placed the camera on her dresser, angled directly at the glass, and hit the record button. Then, with a mixture of fear and determination, she went to bed. The next morning, Emma woke up feeling drained, as if the weight of the night had pressed down on her chest. She reached for her phone with trembling hands, dreading what she might find on the footage. She fast-forwarded through hours of darkness, the room silent except for the occasional rustling of the sheets. And then, just past 3 a.m, the image on the screen changed. Her reflection in the mirror began to ripple, as if the glass were made of water. From the depths of that ripple emerged the shadow of a figure stepping out of the darkness within the mirror itself. It was taller than Emma had realized, its form draped in a shroud of darkness that seemed to absorb all the light around it. The figure's head tilted slightly, as if it were listening, watching her sleep with an almost predatory patience. Emma's breath hitched as she watched the figure lift one hand long, slender fingers reaching out towards her sleeping form. But instead of touching her, its hand pressed against the surface of the mirror, and the glass began to frost over, forming a web of cracks that spread out like icy veins. She watched in horror as the shadow turned its head, and for the first time she saw its face, or rather, the absence of a face. It was a blank void, an emptiness that seemed to draw her in, pulling at her soul with a silent scream. She quickly stopped the video, her heart racing. This wasn't just a shadow, it was something alive, something that was trying to break through. Panic surged through her, and without thinking, she grabbed a sheet and threw it over the mirror, covering it completely. The room seemed to breathe a sigh of relief as the mirror's presence was hidden from view. But that relief was short-lived. As she turned to leave the room, A whisper filled the air, soft, barely audible, but unmistakably real. Emma, it said, her own name spoken in a voice that sounded like the echo of her thoughts. She froze in place, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. Gathering every ounce of courage she had left, Emma whispered back, "What do you want?" There was a long pause, and then the whisper came again, this time more insistent. Let me, and the words were like a cold breath against her skin, chilling her to the core. Emma backed away, her mind racing. She had to get rid of the mirror, destroy it, if necessary. She couldn't allow whatever was in there to cross into her world. She grabbed the covered mirror and dragged it out to her car, determined to take it to the nearest junkyard or landfill. But even as she drove, she felt the weight of the shadow's gaze on her, its presence lingering in the back of her mind. At the junkyard, she wasted no time. She hurled the mirror into the pile of scrap metal, watching as it shattered into countless pieces. The sound of the glass breaking was deafening, almost like a scream trapped in the shards. She stood there, panting, feeling a mix of fear and triumph. It was over, she thought. It had to be over. But as she turned to leave, something glinted in the pile of broken glass. Emma froze. Among the shards, one fragment of the mirror remained intact. And in that fragment, she saw the shadow's face staring back at her, its blank, hollow void somehow filled with rage. Let me, and the whisper echoed once more, louder this time, almost a growl. Emma's vision blurred with tears as she realized the truth. She hadn't destroyed it. She had only angered it. She ran back to her car, slamming the door behind her and speeding away from the junkyard. But even as she drove, her eyes kept flicking to the rearview mirror. And there it was, in the small mirror's reflection, a flicker of darkness, the shadow moving closer, inch by inch. When she got home, Emma locked every door and window, pulling all the curtains closed. She refused to look into any reflective surfaces. She knew that the mirror had been the gateway, but the shadow was free now, no longer bound to the glass. It could find her through any reflection, any glint of light, any surface that could catch her eye. Days turned into weeks, and Emma's life became a series of rituals to avoid reflections. She covered every mirror, avoided windows at night, and even stopped using her phone's front-facing camera. Her friends grew concerned, but she couldn't tell them the truth. They wouldn't believe that she was being hunted by a shadow that lived on the other side of the glass. One night, as she was lying in bed, she felt it again, that cold breath, that whispering voice, closer than ever. Let me in, it said, louder than before, as if it were right there beside her. Emma opened her eyes and saw the smallest sliver of a reflection in her bedside table's lamp. And in that reflection, the shadow's face was waiting, staring at her with that terrifying void where its eyes should be. It was closer now, no longer bound by the mirror, reaching out from the dark corners of her own mind. Emma knew then that she could never truly escape it. The shadow was part of her world now, forever lurking in the reflections, waiting for the moment she let her guard down. And as she lay there, staring into the darkness, she whispered back to it, her voice steady with a strange acceptance, "I will never let you in." The shadow in the mirror didn't disappear. It simply watched her, its blank face filled with an unspoken promise. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Story 7, The Whispering Wall's Secrets Hidden in Silence. Claire had always dreamed of owning an old house, a place filled with history, where every corner had a story to tell. When she found the Victorian-style home on the outskirts of a quiet town, it seemed like a dream come true. The house was a bit rundown, but it had charm and character that new homes simply lacked. There were creaky wooden floors, intricate moldings, and high ceilings that made her feel like she was living in a piece of history. The first few weeks in her new home were everything she had hoped for. Claire spent her days painting walls, restoring old furniture, and breathing life back into the place. She enjoyed the silence, the way the house seemed to settle and sigh as the sun went down. But as the days passed, she began to notice that the silence wasn't quite as peaceful as it seemed. It started with a soft murmur, barely audible, like a distant conversation that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Claire first noticed it one evening while unpacking boxes in the living room. She thought it might be the old pipes groaning or the house settling, but as she paused to listen, she could almost make out words, faint whispers that drifted just out of reach. Must be the wind, she muttered to herself, shaking off the feeling. But as the weeks went by, the whispering grew louder. It wasn't constant, it would come and go at odd times, always when the house was quiet and still. Claire would be sitting in the kitchen or reading in her favorite chair, and the walls would begin to hum with voices low, insistent, as if people were speaking in hushed tones just behind the plaster. One rainy night, as Claire lay in bed listening to the patter of raindrops against the window, the whispers became more distinct. They seemed to seep from the walls, like water from a hidden spring, surrounding her in a cocoon of sound. She strained to catch the words, but they remained just out of grasp, blending together in a chorus of muffled voices. "What are you saying?" she whispered into the darkness, feeling foolish yet compelled to respond. The whispers stopped, almost as if they had heard her, and for a moment there was only silence. Claire lay there, her heart pounding, waiting for the voices to return. When they finally did, they were different, more urgent, more desperate. She could have sworn she heard her own name, spoken softly, but with a tone that was almost pleading. "Claire." She sat up in bed, her pulse racing, her eyes wide in the darkness. "Who's there?" she called out. But there was no answer, just the echo of her own voice bouncing off the walls. Determined to find the source of the voices, Claire began exploring the house more thoroughly in the following days. She tapped on the walls, listened at the baseboards, and checked every nook and cranny for hidden speakers or old wiring that might explain the strange sounds. But she found nothing, no logical explanation for the whispers that seemed to fill the air. One evening, while cleaning out the basement, she stumbled upon a small door she hadn't noticed before, tucked away in a dark corner. It was locked, but Claire felt a strange compulsion to open it. She fetched a rusty old key that she'd found in the attic, and to her surprise, it fit perfectly. The door creaked open to reveal a hidden room, a narrow, dusty space with walls lined in faded wallpaper. Inside, the air was cold and still, carrying the scent of mildew and forgotten years. At the center of the room was an old rocking chair, and on the floor, scattered in a circle, were pieces of paper, old letters, faded photographs, and a small leather-bound journal. Claire picked up the journal, her fingers trembling slightly as she flipped through its brittle pages. The entries were dated from nearly a century ago, written in a neat, flowing script. They spoke of the house and its original occupants, a family who had lived there through joy and heartbreak. The journal detailed their lives, their struggles, their fears. But as Claire read on, the tone of the entries changed, growing darker, more frantic. The final entries were disturbing. They spoke of strange occurrences, of whispers in the walls, of unseen eyes watching from the shadows. "The walls know our secrets," one entry read. "They hear everything, they see everything. I fear they have become a doorway to something else, something that waits in silence." As she turned the last page, a photograph fell out and fluttered to the floor. It was old and yellowed with age, showing a family, parents and two children, standing solemnly in front of the house. But what caught Claire's eye was the background of the photo. In the window of the house, There was a figure, a dark shape that didn't belong, staring out with hollow eyes. Claire's hands shook as she picked up the photo. She recognized that window. It was the one in her living room, the one she had always felt drawn to, as if something behind it was watching her. She felt a chill run down her spine, a deep sense of dread settling in her chest. That night, as she lay in bed with the journal on her nightstand, the whispering returned louder than ever before. This time, the voices were clear, each one distinct, each one calling her name. Claire, Claire, help us. She sat up, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. What do you want? She shouted, her voice cracking with fear. What do you want from me? The whispers grew frantic, overlapping, filling the room with a cacophony of desperate pleas. Help us. Set us free. Claire felt like the walls were closing in on her, the voices pressing against her ears, filling her mind with their cries. She jumped out of bed, grabbed a flashlight, and raced down to the hidden room in the basement. The air grew colder with each step, and she could almost see her breath fogging in the dim light. She knew that the answer lay in the hidden room. She could feel it in her bones. When she reached the narrow space, she aimed the flashlight at the walls and noticed something she hadn't seen before, a small crack in the wallpaper, running from floor to ceiling. She moved closer, peeling back the wallpaper to reveal a hidden message carved into the wood beneath. The words were etched deep, written in a trembling hand. They are trapped. Do not listen. Do not trust the walls. Claire's blood turned to ice as she read the words. Trapped. Who were they? And what had they done to deserve this imprisonment? The whispers returned, louder now, more insistent, begging her to release them. Claire, please. Set us free. But then, amid the pleas, she heard another voice, a low, sinister whisper that seemed to come from the very foundations of the house. Do not release them, it growled. They belong to me. Claire stumbled back, her mind reeling. The house wasn't just haunted, it was alive, a vessel for something dark and ancient that fed on the souls of those who entered. The walls were a prison, holding spirits captive, and now they were using her, trying to manipulate her into setting them free. Torn between fear and empathy, Claire made her choice. She grabbed a can of gasoline from the garage, her hands trembling as she doused the hidden room. The old letters, the journal, and everything that carried the memory of those trapped souls. The voices in the walls screamed at her, some begging for mercy, others cursing her name, but she knew what she had to do. With a heavy heart, Claire struck a match and watched as the flames roared to life, engulfing the room in a bright, hungry blaze. The fire climbed up the walls, devouring the darkness, the whispers turning into shrieks of rage and despair. She stumbled back, tears streaming down her face, as she realized the truth. She was not saving them, she was condemning them to an eternity of silence. The fire department arrived soon after, and by morning the house was nothing but charred remains. They asked her how it started, if she was okay, and all she could do was nod, her voice lost in the ashes of the past. As Claire stood there, watching the smoke rise into the dawn sky, she felt a strange sense of peace, knowing that the whispering walls would never speak again. But even now, in the quiet of the night, she sometimes wonders if she did the right thing. Did she save herself from the darkness within those walls, or had she merely silenced the cries of the innocent souls who begged for her help? She'll never truly know the answer, but one thing is certain: some secrets are meant to remain hidden, and some doors should never be opened. Story 8: The Doll in the Attic, a silent watcher in the shadows. Mia had inherited her grandmother's house, an old Victorian estate that stood on the edge of a quiet town. She remembered visiting the house as a child, its grand halls filled with dusty heirlooms and creaky furniture. Back then, the house had seemed magical, like something out of a fairy tale. But now, as an adult standing in the dimly lit foyer, the house felt different, more like a forgotten relic of a past long gone. She decided to spend the weekend cleaning out the attic, a space she had always been too scared to explore as a child. It was her grandmother's secret haven, filled with treasures from another time. Mia remembered her grandmother warning her never to go up there alone, a stern look on her face whenever the attic was mentioned. But now, curiosity got the better of her. As Mia climbed the narrow stairs to the attic, she was greeted by the smell of old wood and mothballs. The room was filled with antique furniture, trunks overflowing with faded clothes, and boxes covered in thick layers of dust. She pulled open a few trunks, smiling at the sight of old photo albums and hand-knitted blankets. It felt like stepping into a time capsule. But then, something in the far corner of the attic caught her eye, a large wooden chest that seemed out of place, its lid slightly ajar. Mia hesitated, feeling a chill run down her spine. Slowly, she approached the chest and lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in the darkness, was an old porcelain doll. The doll's face was eerily lifelike, with large glass eyes that seemed to follow her every move. Its hair was made of real strands, tied in delicate curls, and its dress was a faded, frilly gown that looked as though it had once been bright and colorful. There was something about the doll that unsettled Mia, a sense that it was more than just a child's toy. As she reached out to touch it, a strange memory surfaced, her grandmother's voice, stern and warning. Never touch the doll, Mia. Leave it alone. It's not for you. Mia pulled her hand back, the echo of those words ringing in her ears. She couldn't remember why her grandmother had been so insistent, but the warning felt suddenly very real. Determined not to let an old memory scare her, Mia picked up the doll. As she did, a small piece of folded paper fell from its lap. She unfolded it, revealing a note written in her grandmother's familiar handwriting: "Do not disturb her rest. She must not be awakened." Mia felt a shiver race down her spine. She glanced at the doll's face, and for a split second, she could have sworn its expression had changed. The once blank, serene face now seemed to carry a hint of a smile, a twisted curve that hadn't been there before. She blinked, and the smile was gone, replaced by the same lifeless stare. She quickly placed the doll back in the chest and closed the lid, deciding to leave it alone as her grandmother had warned. As she turned to head downstairs, she heard a faint sound like the soft creak of fabric stretching, or the tiny scrape of porcelain against wood. Mia froze, her heart pounding, and slowly turned back to the chest. The lid was open again, just a crack. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "I'm imagining things." She closed the lid once more, making sure it was shut tight, and hurried down the stairs. That night, Mia lay in bed, unable to sleep. Her mind kept drifting back to the doll, its glassy eyes, and that almost smile. She told herself that it was just her imagination, but deep down, she knew something was wrong. In the middle of the night, Mia was startled awake by a soft thudding noise. She sat up in bed, listening. It was coming from the attic. Thump, thump, like the sound of small, deliberate footsteps. Her pulse quickened as she grabbed a flashlight and crept toward the attic stairs. The sound grew louder as she got closer, each thump echoing through the quiet house. With trembling hands, she opened the attic door and shone her flashlight into the darkness. The chest was wide open, and the doll was gone. Mia's breath caught in her throat. She swept the beam of her flashlight across the room, her heart racing. And then she saw it standing in the middle of the attic floor, The doll was upright, its glassy eyes fixed directly on her. The twisted smile now fully formed on its face. "What is this?" Mia gasped, backing away. The doll's head tilted slightly to the side, as if it were curious, as if it were watching her fear unfold. She turned and fled down the stairs, slamming the attic door behind her, her mind reeling. She called her best friend, Sarah, who knew all about Mia's inheritance of the old house. When Sarah arrived, Mia was pale and trembling, still holding the flashlight like a weapon. She quickly explained what had happened, her voice shaking as she recounted the doll's movement. "Mia, you know it's probably just your nerves," Sarah said, though her voice wavered slightly. "Let's go up there together. I'm sure we'll find a logical explanation." Reluctantly, Mia led the way back up to the attic, Sarah close behind. When they opened the door, the attic was still and quiet. The wooden chest was closed, and the doll was back in its place, sitting exactly where Mia had first found it, its expression as blank and innocent as ever. "It moved," Mia insisted, her eyes wide with fear. "I swear to you, it was standing right there." Sarah gave her a sympathetic smile. "Maybe you're just tired, Mia. You've been working hard to clean out this place. Old houses can play tricks on you." Mia nodded, though she wasn't convinced. Sarah might have been right about the stress, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something else was going on. Something dark, something that defied all logic. The next few nights were the worst. The noises grew louder, the thumping, the scratching, the faint sound of laughter that seemed to echo through the halls. Mia tried to ignore it, but sleep became impossible. She started seeing shadows darting at the edge of her vision, always in the corners, always where the light didn't quite reach. One evening, she finally decided to confront the doll once and for all. She marched up to the attic with a box and a roll of duct tape, determined to seal the doll inside and get rid of it. But when she opened the attic door, she froze. The doll was sitting at the top of the stairs, staring at her, its head tilted to one side. Its eyes, once so lifeless, seemed to gleam with a cold intelligence, and that smile had grown wider, more sinister. It wasn't just a doll anymore, it was something else entirely, something that seemed to be feeding on her fear. Summoning all her courage, Mia grabbed the doll, stuffed it into the box, and sealed it shut with layers of tape. She carried the box down the stairs, her heart pounding, and threw it into the trunk of her car. She was going to drive to the nearest junkyard and get rid of it once and for all. As she drove, the road ahead seemed to stretch on forever, the streetlights casting long shadows that flickered like ghosts across the pavement. She couldn't shake the feeling that the box in her trunk was somehow alive, that the doll was watching her even now. When she reached the junkyard, Mia didn't waste a moment. She threw the box onto a pile of scrap metal, relieved to see it disappear into the chaos. She stood there for a moment, catching her breath, feeling a sense of freedom she hadn't felt in days. But just as she turned to leave, a sound froze her in place, a soft, childlike giggle that echoed through the empty junkyard. She turned back slowly, her blood running cold, and saw the box now open, lying on the ground. The doll was gone. Mia's heart stopped as she scanned the darkness, her flashlight beam trembling in her hand. And then she saw the doll, standing upright on a nearby pile of rubble, its eyes locked onto hers, that twisted smile even wider than before. The doll raised one tiny hand and waved at her. Mia turned and ran, not stopping until she reached her car. She jumped inside and locked the doors, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She drove home as fast as she could, the darkness pressing in around her like a living thing. That night, as she lay in bed, Mia felt the weight of the doll's presence like a shadow over her soul. She knew it was out there, somewhere in the darkness, waiting for her. She knew it would find its way back to the attic, back to her. And she knew that no matter what she did, no matter how far she ran, she would never truly be rid of it. Somewhere, in the stillness of the night, she could hear the faintest whisper of a child's voice, soft and sweet, calling her name from the shadows. Mia, let's play. She closed her eyes, knowing that her grandmother's warning had been more than just a caution. It had been a plea, desperate attempt to keep the darkness at bay. But it was too late. The doll was awake now, and it was never going to sleep again. Story 9, the silent passenger, a ride that went too far. Jason worked as a night shift taxi driver in the city. It wasn't the most glamorous job, but he liked the quiet hours and the strange stories that came with driving strangers through the city's empty streets. He was used to the odd characters, the drunks, the people lost in their own thoughts as they stared out the window, but he was not prepared for the encounter that awaited him one cold, foggy night. The night started like any other. Jason was halfway through his shift, cruising through the streets, his radio softly playing in the background. He pulled over at a red light when he saw her, a woman standing alone on the corner, shrouded in mist, her long coat trailing down to the ground. She raised her hand to signal him, and Jason felt a chill run through him, though he wasn't sure why. He pulled up to the curb, and she climbed into the back seat without a word, her face hidden by a wide-brimmed hat. She didn't say much, just murmured an address in a voice that was barely above a whisper. It was a residential area on the outskirts of town, not far but not close either. Jason nodded and pulled back into the street, glancing at her through the rearview mirror. "Late night, ha," he said, trying to break the silence. The woman didn't respond. She just sat there, her eyes hidden in the shadow of her hat, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Jason tried again, asking where she was headed and if she'd had a long day, but she remained silent, staring straight ahead. He could feel the temperature in the car drop, colder than it should have been, even for a chilly night like this. He turned up the heater, though it didn't seem to help much. The fog outside thickened, swirling around the car as if trying to seal them in. The streetlights cast long, eerie shadows across the road, making everything seem distorted and unreal. Jason tried to shake off the feeling that something wasn't right. As he drove on, he couldn't resist stealing glances at her in the mirror. There was something off about the way she sat so still, like a statue, completely detached from the world around her. And then he noticed her hands pale, almost ghostly, with fingernails that were too long and pointed, like claws. Jason's heart skipped a beat. He was about to ask her if she was all right when he saw her lips move, barely a whisper escaping them. He leaned closer, straining to hear, and his blood ran cold when he caught the words. "He's watching us." Jason jerked his head around, staring at her. "What did you say?" The woman didn't move, didn't react. She sat perfectly still, her head bowed slightly, as if she hadn't spoken at all. Jason's eyes darted back to the rearview mirror, and that's when he saw a shadowy figure in the back seat, sitting next to the woman, staring straight at him with eyes that seemed to glow in the darkness. He slammed on the brakes, his heart racing, and turned around, expecting to see both of them there. But the seat was empty. Just the woman, sitting alone, her face still hidden under that wide-brimmed hat. Jason took a deep breath, trying to calm his pounding heart. "You're messing with me, right?" he asked, his voice shaking slightly. There was someone else in the back seat, wasn't there? The woman slowly turned her head to face him, and for the first time he saw her eyes cold, dark, and hollow, like empty sockets staring into his soul. "He's still watching," she said, her voice soft but with a note of something else in it, something almost like a warning. Jason's skin crawled as he felt the weight of unseen eyes on him, a presence so strong it was almost suffocating. The fog outside seemed to thicken even more, pressing against the windows like a living thing. He gripped the steering wheel tighter, his knuckles white with fear. "I'm getting you out of here," he said, his voice more to himself than to her. He put the car in drive and started moving again, faster this time, not caring if he broke the speed limit. He just wanted to get to the address, to drop her off and be done with this nightmare ride. The street signs became harder to read through the thick fog, and Jason realized with growing horror that he didn't recognize the area anymore. It was as if the city had shifted around him, the roads twisting into unfamiliar paths. He glanced at the GPS, but it flickered and went blank, the screen filled with static. "What's happening?" he muttered, trying to keep his voice steady. "Where are we?" "You shouldn't have picked me up," the woman whispered, her tone more menacing now. "He doesn't like to be disturbed." "Who is he?" Jason shouted, panic rising in his chest. "What do you mean? Who doesn't like to be disturbed?" "Look ahead," she said, her voice now barely a hiss. Jason turned his eyes back to the road, and his heart stopped. Standing in the middle of the street, shrouded in darkness, was the figure. It was tall and thin, its limbs unnaturally long, stretching out toward the car. Its face was a blur, like a smudge of darkness that shifted and twisted, but its eyes were clear, glowing with an unnatural light, fixed directly on him. Jason swerved, yanking the wheel to avoid the figure. The car skidded across the road, tires screeching, and came to a jarring halt in a cloud of dust and fog. He sat there, panting, his hands shaking on the wheel. He turned to look at the woman, desperate for answers. But she was gone. The back seat was empty, not a trace of her or the presence that had been there just moments before. Jason's mind raced, every rational thought crumbling under the weight of what he had just witnessed. He quickly checked the mirrors, the road, everything around him, but it was like the fog had swallowed her whole. And then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw something in the rearview mirror, a flash of movement. He leaned closer, peering into the mirror, and his stomach dropped. The figure was there again, standing just behind the car, closer this time, its eyes locked onto his. Jason threw the car into gear and sped off, his heart pounding, not daring to look back. He drove through the fog-choked streets, not caring where he was going, just needing to get away from that thing. He didn't stop until he saw the lights of a gas station up ahead, a small beacon in the night. He pulled into the lot, jumped out of the car, and ran inside. The cashier gave him a strange look as he stumbled to the counter, his face pale and drenched in sweat. "You okay, buddy?" the cashier asked. There was a woman in my car," Jason stammered. "And a man, a figure something was there." The cashier frowned. "You mean out on the road?" he asked, confused. "I didn't see anyone." Jason shook his head, his hands trembling. No, they were in my car, and then they just vanished." The cashier's face paled, and he leaned in closer. "You picked her up, didn't you? The lady in the hat." Jason's eyes widened in shock. "You know about her?" The cashier nodded slowly. "Yeah, everyone around here does. They say she's the silent passenger. She appears to drivers late at night, always needing a ride to nowhere. People who pick her up never forget it. They say she's looking for someone, her husband or her lover, and that if you disturb her, he shows up too." Jason's blood ran cold. "Who is he?" The cashier's eyes darkened, his voice dropping to a whisper. "They call him the Watcher. He follows her, protects her. If he thinks you're a threat, he makes sure you never see the sunrise. Jason stumbled back, his mind reeling. He felt like he was trapped in a nightmare that he couldn't wake up from. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice hollow. "Pray," the cashier said grimly. "Pray that he's done with you." Jason staggered out of the gas station, his head spinning. He looked back at his car, the back seat that was once empty now seeming like a black hole, waiting to swallow him whole. He knew he couldn't stay there, couldn't sit in that car with the knowledge of what had just happened. But as he climbed back into the driver's seat, he caught one last look in the rearview mirror. And there, just for a split second, he saw her, the silent passenger, sitting calmly in the back seat, her wide-brimmed hat still hiding her eyes, but that twisted smile playing at the corners of her lips. And beside her, the shadowy figure of the watcher, his glowing eyes never leaving Jason's own. Jason drove off into the foggy night, knowing that no matter how far he ran, he would never truly escape. The silent passenger had chosen him, and the watcher would always follow. And somewhere in the depths of that fog, a pair of unseen eyes were still watching, waiting for the next driver foolish enough to stop and offer a ride. Story 10: The Window in the Woods, a glimpse into darkness. Evelyn loved taking long walks in the woods near her house. The forest was her escape from the world, a place where she could breathe deeply, think clearly, and feel at peace. She knew these woods like the back of her hand, every trail, every hidden stream, every whispering tree. But on that foggy autumn evening, she discovered something that would change her perception of the forest forever. She was following a path she'd walked 100 times before when she noticed something strange, something she'd never seen on her walks before. There, tucked away between two old oak trees, was a small, dilapidated structure. It looked like a window, just a window frame standing upright with no wall or building around it. The frame was old and weathered, its paint peeling and cracked, and the glass in the window was surprisingly clear. Evelyn paused, staring at it in confusion. How had she never seen this before? The window seemed out of place, like a fragment of another world that had been dropped in the middle of the woods. She stepped closer, the damp leaves crunching underfoot, and peered through the glass. On the other side of the window, the forest looked different. The trees were the same, but the colors were off, muted and gray, as if drained of all life. The shadows seemed longer, darker, twisting into shapes that didn't belong. She blinked, rubbed her eyes, and looked again. Everything beyond the window had a slight blur to it, like she was peering into a dream. A cold breeze whispered through the trees, sending a chill down her spine. Evelyn reached out hesitantly, her fingers grazing the edge of the window frame. The moment her skin touched the wood, the glass fogged up, and she saw something move in the distance, something that wasn't part of the forest. A figure. It was just a blur at first, barely more than a shadow shifting between the trees. But then it grew clearer, taking on a human-like shape. It seemed to glide rather than walk, its movements unnaturally smooth and fluid. Evelyn's heart pounded as the figure stopped and turned, its face, or what should have been its face, staring directly at her through the window. The thing had no features, just a blank, smooth surface where eyes, nose, and mouth should have been. Yet she felt its gaze pierce through her, cold and invasive, like fingers digging into her soul. She stumbled back, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps, but she couldn't tear her eyes away from the window. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure was gone, melting back into the shadowed depths of the forest on the other side of the glass. Evelyn's mind raced. Had she really seen that? Was it a trick of the light, a reflection, her imagination playing games with her? Determined to understand what was happening, She leaned closer to the window. But now the glass was clear again, and the forest beyond looked normal, no shadows, no figures, nothing out of the ordinary. She let out a shaky laugh, her breath misting in the cold air. Maybe she was just tired. Maybe the fog and the failing light were messing with her senses. But deep down, she knew that wasn't true. She had felt it, something watching her, something real. Over the next few days, Evelyn couldn't get the window out of her mind. It haunted her thoughts, lurking at the edges of her vision, even when she wasn't in the forest. She found herself drawn back to that spot, compelled to return and face whatever was on the other side. She needed to know if it had been a trick of her mind or if there was something more to that strange, solitary window in the woods. One misty afternoon, she packed a bag with a flashlight, a camera, and a few essentials and set out to find the window again. The fog lay thick over the forest, muffling the sounds of the world around her. She followed the familiar trail, her footsteps barely making a sound on the damp ground, until she reached the place where she'd seen the window. It was still there, standing quietly between the trees like it had always been there, waiting for her. Evelyn approached cautiously, her pulse quickening with each step. She took out her camera and snapped a few pictures of the window, but when she looked at the images, they were blank, just a blur of gray, as if the camera refused to capture what was truly there. She reached out to touch the frame again, and the moment her fingers made contact, the glass fogged up once more. This time, a message appeared, written as if by an invisible hand, "Help me." Evelyn's breath hitched in her throat. She wiped the glass with her sleeve, but the words wouldn't disappear. Instead, they seemed to etch themselves deeper into the glass, glowing faintly against the fog. And then she saw it, the figure, closer now, moving slowly toward her on the other side of the window. It raised one hand, pressing it against the glass, matching her own. A cold, creeping sensation spread from her fingertips up her arm, and she felt a pull, a tugging force that seemed to want to drag her through the window into that other world. She tried to pull back, but her hand was stuck to the glass, like it was fused with the cold, smooth surface. The figure's head tilted, its featureless face somehow conveying a sense of hunger, a longing to escape. "Help me," it mouthed silently, though no sound reached her ears. Evelyn felt its thoughts seep into her mind, a desperate plea mingled with something darker, something that twisted with malice. "No," she whispered, shaking her head, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I won't. I can't." The pull grew stronger, almost overwhelming, and she felt like she was being torn apart, her vision blurring as the world around her dimmed. She closed her eyes, focused all her strength, and yanked her hand free from the window's grip. She stumbled backward, falling to the ground, gasping for air. The window was still there, its glass clear once more. But something had changed. The figure on the other side was no longer trying to come through. It was waiting, watching her with that unreadable expression, as if it had all the time in the world. Evelyn scrambled to her feet, grabbed her bag, and ran. She didn't stop until she was back home, slamming the door shut and locking it behind her. Her hands shook as she pulled out the pictures she'd taken. She stared at them, expecting the same blank images, but now they were different. In each photograph, the window was there, and so was the figure growing closer, its hands pressed against the glass, its featureless face turned toward the camera. And in the last picture, it wasn't just the figure anymore. It was Evelyn's own reflection, staring back at her from the other side of the glass, her eyes wide with terror. She dropped the photos, her blood running cold. That night, Evelyn couldn't sleep. Every sound in the house seemed amplified, every creak and groan of the wood sending chills down her spine. She kept glancing at the windows, afraid she'd see that featureless face staring back at her. At dawn, she made a decision. She had to destroy the window, to break whatever connection it had with her. She packed a sledgehammer and some gasoline and headed back into the woods, determined to end it once and for all. When she reached the clearing, the window was waiting, just as she'd left it. She wasted no time. She swung the sledgehammer with all her strength, smashing the glass. But instead of shattering, the glass seemed to absorb the blow, rippling like water. Evelyn's fear turned to desperation. She doused the window frame with gasoline, her hands shaking, and lit a match. She threw it at the base of the window, watching as the flames roared to life. For a moment, she thought she'd succeeded. The fire seemed to consume the wood, licking up its sides. But then the flames twisted, changing color to a cold blue, and were sucked into the glass itself, disappearing as if swallowed by the other world. The figure reappeared, clearer than ever, its hand reaching through the glass, breaking the barrier. No, Evelyn screamed, stumbling back as the figure stepped halfway through the window. It was no longer just a shadow. It had substance, formed a grotesque mockery of a human, twisted and wrong. Its featureless face turned toward her, and it opened its mouth in a silent scream. Evelyn ran, her mind racing, knowing now that there was no way to destroy the window. It was a portal, a doorway to something beyond this world, and whatever lived on the other side had found her. She reached the edge of the woods and looked back one last time. The window stood there, untouched, as if nothing had happened. But now in its glass she could see herself not as she was, but as a shadowy figure, trapped on the other side, reaching out in vain. "Help me," her reflection whispered, her own voice twisted into something unrecognizable. Evelyn knew then that the window wasn't just a fragment of another world. It was a trap, a lure to pull the curious and the desperate into its grasp. And once it had you in its sights, there was no escape. Even now, when she passes by those woods, Evelyn swears she can feel its gaze waiting, watching, a doorway to darkness that will never, ever let her go. Story 11: The Watcher in the Hallway, a presence you can't escape. Sam always prided himself on being a logical person. He was the kind of guy who needed proof, evidence, something concrete before he'd believe in anything remotely supernatural. So when he moved into his new apartment in an old building on the outskirts of town, he didn't think twice about the rumors. People said the place was haunted, that strange things happened in the hallways at night. Sam just laughed it off, chalking it up to local ghost stories designed to spook newcomers. The apartment itself was perfect, small but comfortable, with a long, narrow hallway that led from the front door to the living room. The hallway had a series of old photographs lining the walls, images of the building from decades past, its former tenants staring out in black and white silence. Sam found them oddly charming, a nod to the building's history. But as the days passed, he started to notice something strange. It wasn't anything he could put his finger on at first, just a feeling like he wasn't alone. Sometimes, when he was walking down the hallway late at night, he'd feel a shiver run down his spine, a cold draft that seemed to come from nowhere. He told himself it was just the old building settling, the way old places tend to do. Then one night, while he was up late reading in the living room, he heard a faint sound coming from the hallway. It was a soft, rhythmic tapping, like someone drumming their fingers against the wall. Sam's first thought was that a neighbor was moving around upstairs, but the noise seemed to grow louder, more insistent, coming closer to his apartment door. Sam put down his book and walked to the hallway. As he approached, the tapping stopped abruptly. He stood there for a moment, straining to hear anything else, but all he could sense was the silence pressing in on him. With a shake of his head, he turned and headed back to the living room, convinced it was just his mind playing tricks on him. But that was only the beginning. The next night, as Sam was brushing his teeth, he glanced into the hallway mirror and saw a shadow standing at the far end of the hall. It was tall and thin, almost humanoid but not quite. Its limbs seemed elongated, twisted, like they were stretching toward him. He blinked, and the shadow was gone, the hallway empty, as if nothing had been there. Sam's pulse quickened as he stared into the empty space. He told himself it was just a trick of the light, maybe a shadow cast by the streetlights outside. But the image of that figure, its unnatural shape, was burned into his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that he'd seen something real, something that wasn't supposed to be there. Determined to prove that he was just being paranoid, Sam set up a small camera in the hallway that night, pointing it directly at where he had seen the shadow. He hit record and went to bed, trying to convince himself that he'd find nothing but an empty hallway in the morning. When he woke up, Sam hesitated before checking the camera. He took a deep breath and pressed play, watching the footage scroll by on fast forward. For hours, nothing happened. The hallway remained still, bathed in the soft glow of the nightlight. And then, just after 3 a.m., the camera picked up something, a movement, a flicker in the darkness. The shadow reappeared, this time closer to the camera, its form more distinct. Sam felt his breath hitch as he saw the figure step out of the darkness, its head tilting slightly, as if observing the camera. It didn't move like a person, it seemed to glide, its limbs bending in unnatural angles, like a puppet on invisible strings. And then it did something that made Sam's blood run cold. It turned to face the camera directly, and though it had no visible features, Sam could feel its gaze, like it was looking right at him through the screen, as if it knew he was watching. The camera suddenly cut to static, the screen filled with a burst of white noise, and when the image returned, the hallway was empty again. Sam stared at the screen, his hands shaking. He rewound the footage and played it again, over and over, but each time the figure vanished into the static, leaving him with more questions than answers. That night, Sam could hardly sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the shadow in the hallway, the way it seemed to reach out to him, calling to him in silence. He lay in bed, listening to the creaks and groans of the old building, every sound amplified in the darkness. Around 3 a.m., he heard it again, the soft tapping sound coming from the hallway. Sam sat up, his heart pounding, and turned on the light. The tapping stopped immediately, but he could feel a presence, a coldness in the air that seemed to press against his skin. He got out of bed and opened the door to the hallway, and there it was. The shadow stood at the far end of the hall, its head tilted to one side, watching him. Sam's breath caught in his throat as the figure took a step toward him, and then another, its movement slow and deliberate. He backed away, his hands shaking, and slammed the bedroom door shut. He grabbed his phone and dialed his best friend, Mark, who knew about the strange occurrences in the apartment. "Mark, I need you to come over right now," Sam said, his voice trembling. "There's something in my hallway. I don't know what it is, but it's here." Mark arrived within minutes, finding Sam pale and shaken at the apartment door. Together, they stepped into the hallway, Mark holding a flashlight. The beam of light sliced through the darkness, revealing nothing but the empty corridor. The shadow was gone. "You sure you saw something?" Mark asked, though his voice carried a note of doubt. Sam nodded, his face set with determination. "I'm not crazy, Mark. I've got footage of it. There's something here, watching me. I can feel it." Mark looked skeptical but agreed to stay the night on the couch. They set up a series of cameras, all pointing down the hallway, determined to catch whatever was haunting Sam's apartment. They watched the live feed in silence, waiting for something, anything, to appear. Around 3:15 a.m., the room seemed to grow colder, a chill settling over them. And then, there was the shadow flickering into view at the end of the hallway. This time it didn't just stand there. It started to move, its limbs twisting, bending as it crept closer. Mark's eyes widened in disbelief. "What the hell is that?" he whispered. The figure moved to the nearest photograph on the wall, a picture of the building's original tenants, and touched it with one elongated finger. The glass cracked instantly, spiderwebbing across the surface, as the shadow's touch spread through the frame. Sam and Mark stared in horror as the shadow turned, and for the first time it spoke. A low, raspy whisper filled the air, words forming in a language neither of them understood. The hallway lights flickered, dimming to almost nothing, and the shadow seemed to grow, its form expanding, filling the space. "You have seen too much," it whispered, the voice sounding like it came from the walls themselves. "You are not welcome here." And just like that, the lights went out completely, plunging them into darkness. Sam felt a rush of cold air blast through the hallway, and when the lights flickered back on, the shadow was gone. The photographs on the wall had all shattered, their pieces littering the floor. Mark turned to Sam, his face pale and stunned. "We need to get out of here," he said. Now. They grabbed what they could and bolted from the apartment, not stopping until they were outside in the crisp night air. Sam's mind raced as he tried to comprehend what had just happened. He knew that shadow wasn't just a ghost or a trick of the light, it was something far older, far darker. The next day, Sam decided to research the building's history. He discovered that it had once been a boarding house in the early 1900s, a place where people mysteriously vanished without a trace. The legend spoke of a figure known as the Watcher, an entity that dwelled in the hallways, feeding on the fear of those who lived there. The Watcher was said to be a guardian of the building's secrets, a sentinel that ensured the souls trapped within its walls never found peace. Those who saw the Watcher were marked, chosen to join the others lost in the building's endless corridors, never to be seen again. Sam moved out of the apartment that very week, but the memory of that night, the feeling of the Watcher's gaze upon him, never left. He could still see it sometimes, in the corner of his eye, in the darkened hallways of his new place. The tapping would start late at night, a reminder that he could never truly escape. And every time he looked into a mirror or a shadowed corner, he half expected to see it there, the Watcher, waiting, watching, ready to reclaim what belonged to it. Sam knew then that the Watcher wasn't bound to that old building. It had followed him, marked him, as one of its own. And no matter where he went, no matter how far he ran, it would always be there, lurking in the darkness, waiting for him to slip back into its grasp. Story 12, the clock that ticks backward, time moves against you. Elena had always been fascinated by antique shops, the kind that seemed to hold 1,000 secrets within their dusty shelves. One chilly afternoon, she wandered into a small, out-of-the-way store that she had never noticed before. The shop was packed with old furniture, faded books, and curiosities from another era. But what caught her eye was a peculiar clock, tucked away on a high shelf in the corner. It was a grandfather clock, tall and ornate, with a dark wooden frame and brass details that glinted in the dim light. The pendulum swayed back and forth, and its face was carved with delicate, intricate patterns. But what struck Alina as odd was the direction of its hands. They moved backward, ticking in reverse. Intrigued, she asked the shopkeeper about it. The old man's eyes seemed to darken slightly as he looked at the clock. "Ah, the timepiece that defies time," he said with a crooked smile. "It's said to be a rare piece, one that doesn't just tell the hours, it changes them. People say it's cursed, but I think of it more as misunderstood." Alina, always a skeptic, laughed off the idea of a cursed clock. She loved the strange and the unusual, and this clock seemed like the perfect addition to her apartment. Without hesitation, she bought it, unaware of the darkness she was bringing into her life. When she got home, she placed the clock in her living room, its presence adding a touch of old-world charm to the space. She wound it up, listening to the satisfying click of its gears, and watched as the hands continued their backward journey. For a while, the clock was just an interesting conversation piece, a quirky relic from the past. But then, the strangeness began. Elena first noticed it when she was getting ready for work. She checked the time on her phone. It was 7:45 a.m. She glanced at the clock, and to her surprise, it showed 7:15 a.m., the hands ticking steadily backward. She laughed, thinking it must be stuck or malfunctioning, and went on with her day. But as the days went by, she started noticing more than just the odd time on the clock. Moments in her life seemed to rewind. One evening, as she was making dinner, she accidentally knocked over a glass of water. She watched in shock as the water spilled across the counter, only for it to suddenly draw back into the glass, as though the moment had reversed itself. She blinked, staring at the dry countertop, wondering if she was losing her mind. The incidents became more frequent. She would drop her keys, only to watch them rise back into her hand. Conversations she'd had with friends would suddenly reset, as if she'd never said a word. Elena tried to tell herself it was just her imagination, but deep down, she knew it had something to do with the clock. One night, as she lay in bed, she heard an extra tick, slow and deliberate, echoing through the quiet apartment. It was different from the regular rhythm of the clock. She sat up, listening, and felt a cold shiver run down her spine. The sound seemed to pulse through the walls, a heartbeat of time moving in reverse. She got out of bed and walked into the living room, her eyes fixed on the clock. The hands moved faster now, spinning backward in a blur, the ticking sound growing louder, almost like whispers hidden beneath the beat. She reached out to touch the clock, and the moment her fingers brushed its surface, everything stopped. The room went silent, frozen in place. She pulled her hand back in shock, and as soon as she did, the world snapped back to life, but not quite as it had been. The furniture was slightly different, the lights dimmer, and the air felt heavy, as if the room was filled with a presence she couldn't see. Alina's mind raced. She felt as though she had stepped into a different version of her own apartment, a place that looked the same but felt fundamentally wrong. The clock stood there, its hands ticking backward in a steady, relentless rhythm, almost as if it were mocking her. She decided she needed to get rid of it. This clock was more than just an antique, it was a gateway to something beyond her understanding. The next morning, she packed it up and drove to the antique store, determined to return it. But when she got there, the shop was gone, vanished, as if it had never existed. Alina stood on the empty sidewalk, her hands trembling. She checked the address, certain she was in the right place, but there was nothing there. Just a vacant lot, overgrown with weeds, with no sign that a shop had ever stood there. She drove home in a daze, the clock still in her back seat, ticking louder now, each sound like a knife against her nerves. She didn't know what to do. Every time she thought about smashing it, breaking it to pieces, a sense of dread filled her, as if the clock itself was warning her not to. That night, the strangeness reached its peak. Alina sat in her living room, staring at the clock, determined to confront it once and for all. As she watched, the clock's hands began to move faster, the ticking growing louder and louder, until it sounded like a roar in her ears. The pendulum swung wildly, back and forth, casting shadows that twisted across the walls. Suddenly, the air around her seemed to ripple, and Alina felt herself pulled backward. It was as if time itself had snapped, yanking her out of the present. She found herself standing in her kitchen, holding the same glass of water she'd spilled days ago. But this time, the water didn't fall to the counter. It hovered in midair, droplets suspended like tiny orbs, before slowly moving back into the glass. She felt sick, like her whole body was being pulled inside out. Memories she'd forgotten flashed before her eyes in reverse, playing out scenes from her life like a film unwinding. Her childhood home, her first love, her heartbreaks, all flickering past her in quick succession. And then, to her horror, she saw things she didn't remember at all. Images of herself in different places, different times, standing in rooms she'd never been in, talking to people she didn't know. It was as if the clock wasn't just taking her back through her own past, but through lives she had never lived. She watched herself grow younger, her face smoothing out, her hair darkening, until she was a child again, then an infant, then nothing more than a thought on the edge of existence. Alina screamed, a sound that seemed to echo through the fabric of reality itself, and suddenly she was back in her living room, the clocks ticking, the only sound in the world. She was on her knees, gasping for breath, her hands clutching the floor. She looked up at the clock, and its hands were still moving, ticking backward at a steady pace. But now, she could see the truth. The face of the clock wasn't just a dial. It was an eye that watched her, unblinking, calculating. It was alive, and it was alive, and it was aware of her. She realized that the clock wasn't just measuring time, it was feeding on it, pulling moments from her life and consuming them. Desperate, Alina grabbed a hammer from her toolbox and swung it at the clock with all her strength. The hammer connected, and for a moment she felt resistance. But instead of shattering, the clock seemed to absorb the impact, rippling like water. A laugh, hollow and metallic, echoed from its depths. Futile, a voice whispered from within the clock, a sound that seemed to come from every corner of the room at once. Time cannot be destroyed, only consumed. The pendulum stopped swinging, and the hands of the clock reversed their direction, now moving forward at a terrifying speed. The room around her began to age, dust thickened on the surfaces, paint peeled from the walls, the lights flickered and went out. The world was moving on without her, dragging her into a future that was not her own. No, she screamed, as the clock's laughter grew louder. You can't have me. And then, everything went silent. When she opened her eyes, she was standing in the empty apartment, the same apartment, but it wasn't hers anymore. The clock was gone. The furniture was covered in sheets, and the windows were boarded up. She heard voices outside, muffled conversations about the old place where the woman disappeared years ago. Alina ran to the door, but when she opened it, she found herself looking out into the same room she had just left, like a reflection, a loop that had no end. She was trapped, caught in the clock's endless game. No matter where she turned, the door always led her back to the same empty space. The last thing she saw, in the corner of the room, was a flash of brass and new clock, identical to the one she had bought, ticking steadily backward. She realized then that she was no longer outside of time, but part of it, another memory caught within the gears of its impossible machine. And now, every time the clock ticks, it moves closer to the next person who dares to wind its gears, to touch its face, to believe. They can control time. But Elena will always be there, just a shadow within the clock's glass, watching, waiting, a prisoner of moments that will never truly belong to her again. Story 13, The Call from the Basement Voices from Below. Sophie had never liked basements. Growing up, the one in her family home was always a place she avoided. It was dark, cold, and filled with old boxes and forgotten memories. So when she moved into her new house and saw the basement door in the hallway, a familiar unease crept over her. Still, she shrugged it off. It was just a basement, after all, nothing more. For the first few weeks, Sophie didn't think much about it. She kept the door closed and tried not to venture down there. Life in the new house was busy, and there were enough things to focus on without worrying about a dusty, unused room. But that all changed one evening when the phone rang. Sophie was in the living room, unpacking boxes, when she heard the faint ringing of a phone. It wasn't her cell phone, which lay silent on the table beside her. This ringing was coming from somewhere else, somewhere deep in the house. She followed the sound down the hallway, her ears straining to pinpoint its source. It was coming from the basement. Her stomach twisted as she stared at the basement door, the ringing growing louder, echoing up the stairs. Sophie hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorknob. She didn't have a landline in the house, just her cell phone. So what was ringing down there? Taking a deep breath, she opened the door. Cold air wafted up from the darkness below, carrying with it the faint, musty smell of earth and mold. The ringing continued, more insistent now, urging her to come closer. She grabbed a flashlight and stepped onto the first step, then another, the wood creaking under her weight. As she descended into the darkness, the ringing became clearer, more tangible, like it was pulling her into its grip. She reached the bottom of the stairs and swung the flashlight beam across the room, revealing old furniture covered with dusty sheets, stacks of boxes, and a tangle of cobwebs. The sound was coming from a small, antique rotary phone sitting on a table in the far corner of the basement. Sophie stared at it in disbelief. The phone looked ancient, with a faded black casing and a heavy receiver. Its rotary dial was cracked, the numbers barely visible. She had never seen this phone before and had no idea how it got there. And yet, it was ringing. She reached out with a trembling hand, hesitating before finally picking up the receiver. The ringing stopped abruptly, replaced by a crackling silence that seemed to stretch on forever. "Hello," she said, her voice barely a whisper. There was no answer at first, just a faint static on the line. Then, a voice came through, soft and distant, as if speaking from the depths of a well. "Sophie," it said, and she felt a chill crawl up her spine. "Who is this?" she demanded, trying to keep her voice steady. "You need to help me," the voice continued, ignoring her question. "I'm trapped. Please. You have to find me." Sophie's heart raced. The voice sounded familiar, like an echo of her own thoughts, yet distorted, twisted. "Who are you? Where are you trapped?" she asked, her voice shaking. But there was no response, just a burst of static, followed by the dull click of the line disconnecting. She stared at the phone in her hand, unable to comprehend what had just happened. She quickly hung up, turned on her heel, and fled back up the stairs, slamming the basement door behind her. She spent the rest of the evening trying to convince herself that it had all been a prank, some old wiring in the house picking up a random signal, maybe. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that the call was real, that someone or something was trying to reach out to her from the darkness below. The next few nights were restless. Sophie lay in bed, her mind filled with the sound of that ringing phone and the desperate voice on the other end. She avoided the basement at all costs, but she couldn't avoid the growing sense of dread that followed her through every room of the house. Then, just as she was starting to convince herself that it was all in her head, the phone rang again. It was late, well past midnight, when the familiar sound echoed through the quiet house. Sophie sat bolt upright in bed, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. The ringing came from the basement, louder this time, more urgent. She grabbed her flashlight and her phone, dialing her best friend Emma's number as she headed toward the door. "Emma," she said as soon as her friend picked up. "It's happening again. The phone is ringing in the basement." "Are you sure it's not just a dream?" Emma replied, her voice groggy with sleep. "No," Sophie insisted. "I'm wide awake, and it's real. I need you to come over, please." "Okay, I'm on my way," Emma said, now fully alert. "Don't go down there until I get there." Sophie agreed, but as soon as she hung up, the ringing grew even louder, almost like a scream demanding her attention. She couldn't wait. She had to know who was on the other end. Before she could stop herself, she was at the basement door, opening it, and descending the stairs once more. When she reached the bottom, the phone was already in her hand, the receiver cold against her skin. She lifted it to her ear, the static hissing like 1,000 whispers. "Hello," she said, her voice shaking. This time the voice was clearer, more intense, almost like a mirror of her own. "Sophie, please," it begged. "I'm you. I'm trapped down here. You have to help me before it's too late." "What do you mean?" "You're me," Sophie demanded, her mind reeling. "This is insane." "Listen," the voice said, urgent and trembling. "The basement is a doorway to something else. If you don't help me, you'll be next. Don't let it take you." Before Sophie could respond, the basement light flickered and then went out, plunging her into darkness. The temperature in the room plummeted, and she felt a presence cold, malevolent, something lurking just beyond her vision. The phone crackled again, but this time it wasn't her voice on the line. It was something else, something darker. A deep, hollow laughter filled the receiver, echoing through the basement. "You cannot escape," the new voice whispered, its tone mocking. "She is already lost. And now it's your turn." Sophie's breath hitched as she dropped the phone, the clatter echoing in the silence. She fumbled for her flashlight and turned it on, sweeping the beam across the room. There in the corner, she saw a shadow shifting, twisting, slowly forming into a figure that seemed to step out of the darkness itself. The shape moved toward her, its form undefined, like smoke trapped in the shape of a human, eyes glowing with an eerie light. Sophie stumbled back, her mind screaming to get away, to run. She turned and raced up the stairs, her feet pounding on the wood, each step echoing like a drumbeat. Just as she reached the top, the basement door slammed shut, trapping her hand between the frame and the door. She cried out in pain, yanking her hand free, and managed to throw the door open. She stumbled into the hallway just as Emma arrived, breathless and wide-eyed. "Sophie," Emma shouted, grabbing her by the shoulders. "What happened? Are you okay?" "The basement," Sophie gasped. "There's something down there. It said it was me, but it's not. It's not me." Emma looked confused but resolute. "We need to see this thing," she said. "Whatever it is, we're going to face it together." Armed with flashlights and a heavy sense of dread, they descended the stairs once more. But when they reached the bottom, the basement was empty. The rotary phone sat silent on the table, the air still and cold, like a tomb. "You sure you heard something?" Emma asked, though her voice was now laced with doubt. Sophie stared at the phone, her mind spinning. "It was here," she whispered. "I swear, it was here." Just as they were about to leave, the phone rang again, sharper, louder than before. Emma jumped back, and Sophie's heart stopped. She reached out, hesitated for a moment, then picked up the receiver. But this time, there was no static, no voice, just a soft, rhythmic tapping, like something drumming against the phone's casing. And then the voice returned, faint and distant. "It's too late," it said. "You shouldn't have answered." Before they could react, the basement light flickered on and off, and the temperature dropped even further. The shadows on the wall began to move, coalescing into the shape of a figure that looked exactly like Sophie, only twisted, distorted, its face a mask of fear and anger. "You didn't save me," the doppelganger hissed, its eyes burning with an unnatural light. "Now you'll join me in the dark." The room plunged into darkness, and the only sound was the hum of the phone's dial tone, ringing louder and louder until it drowned out all thought. Sophie felt herself being pulled, dragged toward the shadowy figure, its arms outstretched, ready to consume her. And then, as quickly as it began, everything stopped. The lights flickered back on, and the basement was empty once more. The phone lay on the floor, silent. Emma reached out and shook Sophie, who seemed frozen in place, her eyes wide with terror. "Let's get out of here," Emma whispered, and together they fled the basement, slamming the door shut behind them. Sophie moved out of the house the very next day, leaving the basement and its secrets behind. But even in her new apartment, she could still hear at sometimes the faint ringing of a rotary phone, calling to her from some forgotten place below. And every time it rang, she knew the truth. The call from the basement was not just a cry for help. It was a warning, a curse, a reminder that somewhere in the darkness, another version of her was waiting to take her place. Story 14, The Face in the Window Eyes That Never Blink. Maggie had just moved into a small, quaint house on the outskirts of town, surrounded by trees and an eerie kind of quiet that was a far cry from the noise of the city. She thought it would be a peaceful place to focus on her writing, a place where inspiration could find her without distractions. But her first night in the new house, she began to feel that the silence held secrets. The living room had large windows that looked out onto the front yard. Maggie loved the idea of natural light flooding in during the day, but at night, those windows took on a different character. The darkness outside seemed to press against the glass, and it was impossible to see anything beyond her own reflection. On her first evening, as she was unpacking a box of books, Maggie caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of her eye. A face pale, gaunt, staring at her from the window. She gasped, turning quickly to get a better look, but saw only her own reflection and the darkness beyond. She told herself it was just a trick of the light, the result of exhaustion from the long day of unpacking. But that image of the face wouldn't leave her mind. It lingered in her thoughts like a shadow creeping into the corners of her consciousness, even when she tried to forget. The following night, Maggie sat at her desk, typing away on her laptop, the glow of the screen casting a soft light around her. The windows were a black mirror, and she tried not to look at them, telling herself that it was silly to be afraid of something that wasn't there. But then she saw it again. The face was back, clearer this time, pressed against the window like it was trying to peer inside. Its eyes were wide, too wide, and its mouth was slightly open, like it was on the verge of whispering something. Maggie's heart jumped into her throat as she spun around in her chair, only to find the window empty once more. She jumped to her feet, rushing to turn on all the lights in the house. She closed the curtains, every one of them, and tried to convince herself that she was just tired, that her eyes were playing tricks on her. But deep down, she knew that wasn't the truth. The face she'd seen was too real, too vivid to be a figment of her imagination. Over the next few days, the sightings became more frequent. Each night, no matter how tightly she closed the curtains or how many lights she turned on, Maggie would catch glimpses of the face in the window. Sometimes it was watching her from the kitchen window, sometimes from the living room. Always the same face, pale, expressionless, with those eyes that never blinked. Desperate for answers, Maggie called her friend Jess, who was always the rational one in their group. "You're just stressed," Jess said over the phone. "Moving is a big deal, and it can mess with your head. How about I come over and we can check it out together?" Maggie agreed, and the next evening, Jess showed up with a flashlight and a determined look on her face. They went around the house, checking the windows, looking for any sign of someone lurking outside. They found nothing, just the trees swaying gently in the breeze and the sound of leaves rustling in the darkness. "See? There's no one out there," Jess said, trying to sound convincing. "It's probably just the reflection of your own face. Sometimes when it's dark outside and you're lit up inside, your brain can play tricks on you." Maggie nodded, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. As they settled in for the night, Jess made light of the situation, telling funny stories to ease the tension. Maggie almost started to believe her friend that maybe it was all in her head. But then, just as they were about to call it a night, the power went out. The house plunged into darkness, the sudden silence almost deafening. Maggie's heart raced as she reached for her flashlight, the beam shaking slightly in her trembling hand. Jess stood still, staring toward the window. "Maggie," Jess whispered, her voice trembling. "Don't move." Maggie followed her gaze to the window and felt her blood turn to ice. The face was there, pressed right against the glass. Only this time, it wasn't just a face, it was a whole figure. A gaunt, shadowy figure with eyes like black voids staring in at them. Its mouth opened, revealing a wide, hollow grin, and it raised one skeletal hand to the glass. The figure didn't move like a person. It seemed to flicker, like an image on a glitchy screen, shifting in and out of focus, yet its eyes never left Maggie's. Jess stumbled backward, knocking over a chair, her face pale with terror. "What the hell is that?" Jess gasped, barely able to get the words out. Maggie couldn't answer. She felt like the figure was pulling her in, its eyes locking onto hers, dragging her deeper into the darkness that seemed to surround it. Then, just as suddenly, the power came back on. The lights flickered to life, and the figure vanished. They both stood there, shaking, staring at the empty window. Jess grabbed her phone, hands trembling as she dialed the police. "We need to get out of here," she said, her voice cracking. "Now." They fled the house and waited outside on the cold driveway until the police arrived. The officers searched the entire property, checked the yard, and even looked through the nearby woods. They found no sign of anyone, no footprints, no evidence that anyone had been there. It could have been a trespasser, one of the officers said, though he sounded doubtful. Or a trick of the light, maybe a reflection from inside. Maggie and Jess knew what they'd seen, but no amount of explaining would make the officers believe them. After the police left, Jess insisted on staying the night, but Maggie couldn't relax. She kept seeing that face every time she closed her eyes, that grin that seemed to taunt her from the other side of the window. As the hours passed and Jess finally fell asleep on the couch, Maggie stayed awake, staring at the window. The house was quiet, too quiet, and the silence felt like a living thing, pressing in on her from all sides. And then, at around 3 a.m., she heard a soft tapping on the glass. She turned her head slowly, dread pooling in her stomach. The face was back, but this time it was closer than ever, pressed against the glass with its hollow eyes fixed on her. Maggie felt a scream rise in her throat, but it caught there, trapped by the terror that froze her in place. The face mouthed something, a single word that fogged the glass. "Come dot." Maggie shook her head, backing away slowly. But the figure's eyes followed her every move, and its grin widened as if it knew a secret she could never understand. She grabbed her phone, aimed its flashlight at the window, and for a moment the light revealed something horrifying. The figure wasn't outside. It was inside the glass itself, like a twisted reflection trapped within the window pane, its face pressed against the other side of reality. Its hand reached out, its fingers splayed against the glass, as though it was trying to break through. With trembling hands, Maggie yanked the curtains closed, but it didn't matter. She could still feel the thing watching her, could almost hear its breath against the glass, whispering her name over and over. She tried to wake Jess, shaking her by the shoulders. "Jess, wake up," Maggie shouted. "We have to leave. Now." Jess woke up groggy and confused, but when she saw the panic in Maggie's eyes, she didn't hesitate. They grabbed their things and ran out of the house into the night. Maggie refused to look back at the windows, afraid of what she might see staring back at her. They stayed at a motel for the rest of the night, huddled together, not saying a word. Maggie's mind raced with thoughts of the face in the window, the way it seemed to live inside the glass. She knew now that it wasn't just an intruder or a trick of the light. The next day, they went back to the house in broad daylight. Maggie's heart sank when she saw that every window had cracked from the inside, tiny fractures spider-webbing across the glass, as if something had tried to force its way through. She moved out of the house that week, unable to bear the thought of living there another day. But even after she settled into a new place, she couldn't escape the feeling that the face was still watching her. Every time she passed a window or looked into a mirror, she saw the faint outline of those hollow eyes, waiting for her to look just a little too closely. And then one night, as she was getting ready for bed, she heard it again, the soft tapping, this time on her bedroom window. She turned slowly, heart pounding, and there it was. The face grinning back at her, its eyes gleaming in the dark. It whispered her name, a sound like wind through broken glass. "Come dot." And she knew then that the face in the window wasn't just trapped, it was waiting. And it would. Never stop until it found a way to pull her through. Story 15, The Whisper Under the Bed, Secrets Beneath the Silence. Katie had always considered herself too old to be afraid of the dark. At 28, she had outgrown the childhood fears of monsters lurking in closets or under the bed. But when she moved into her new apartment, a tiny one-bedroom place on the edge of the city, those old fears began to creep back in. The first few nights were normal enough. Katie unpacked her boxes, set up her furniture, and slowly began to settle in. The place was quiet, almost too quiet, with only the occasional creak of the old wooden floors to break the silence. But that stillness brought with it a sense of unease that Katie couldn't shake. One night, as she lay in bed trying to fall asleep, she heard a faint, almost inaudible whisper coming from somewhere below her. She froze, holding her breath, straining her ears to catch the sound again. There it was, soft and slow, like a voice speaking in hushed tones right under her bed. Katie sat up, her eyes wide with alarm. She listened carefully, but the whispering stopped the moment she moved. She reached for her bedside lamp, turning it on, flooding the room with light. She glanced around, her heart racing, but everything looked perfectly normal. She got out of bed and knelt down, peering into the darkness beneath her bed frame. All she could see were a few boxes of books and some old clothes she hadn't found a place for yet, nothing out of the ordinary. Telling herself it was just her imagination playing tricks on her, she climbed back into bed and turned off the light. But as soon as the room was dark again, the whispering returned. This time it was clearer, closer. A soft voice speaking words she couldn't quite understand, like a chant or a lullaby sung in reverse. Katie's skin prickled with goosebumps. She turned on the light once more, and just as before, the whispering stopped, leaving her alone in the silence. Katie didn't sleep much that night. She lay awake, her eyes fixed on the ceiling, trying to convince herself that it was just the house settling, or the wind outside, or maybe even a neighbor's TV set turned too low. Anything but the idea that someone or something was under her bed, whispering to her in the dark. The next morning, after a restless night, she decided to talk to her friend Carla about it. Carla was the practical type, the kind of person who didn't believe in ghosts or things that go bump in the night. "You're just stressed," Carla said when they met for coffee. "New place, different noises. Old buildings make sounds you're not used to. It's probably nothing." Katie nodded, trying to believe her friend's rational explanation. But that night, when she lay down in bed and turned off the light, the whispering came back louder, clearer, more insistent. She could almost make out words this time, fragments of sentences that seemed to echo in her mind. "Come." Closer the voice whispered, so softly that it was almost like a breeze brushing against her ear. "I'm waiting." Katie's blood turned to ice. She lay still, her muscles tense, staring into the darkness, too afraid to move. The voice was so close, it felt like whoever was speaking was just inches away from her face. Summoning all her courage, Katie jumped out of bed, grabbed a flashlight, and pointed it at the floor. She knelt down slowly, lifting the dust ruffle that hung down from the mattress, and shone the light into the darkness beneath her bed. The beam illuminated nothing but the old boxes, a few stray socks, and the cold wooden floor. There was no sign of anyone or anything hiding there. She let out a shaky breath, her hands trembling as she tried to steady the flashlight. But just as she was about to turn away, she heard it again this time, directly in her ear. "Don't leave me alone down here," the voice said, clear and pleading. Katie stumbled back, dropping the flashlight, her heart racing. The whisper had been so real, so close, that she could almost feel the breath on her skin. She ran to the living room, turned on every light in the apartment, and grabbed her phone. She didn't know who to call or what to say, but she knew she couldn't stay in the bedroom, not after what she had just heard. Desperate for answers, she reached out to the landlord the next morning, asking if he knew anything strange about the apartment's history. "It's an old building," the landlord said dismissively. "Settles a lot at night. Sometimes you'll hear creaks and groans, but that's normal. Haven't had any complaints from the last tenant." Katie pressed for more details, but the landlord seemed reluctant to say much else. The last tenant left pretty quickly, he admitted. Said she was moving for a job. But you know, people come and go all the time in this business. Feeling frustrated and unnerved, Katie decided to do some digging on her own. She searched online for any information she could find about the apartment, looking up old records, news articles, anything that might explain the strange occurrences. And then, buried in the archives of a local news website, she found something that made her blood run cold. The apartment had been the scene of a disappearance nearly 10 years ago. A woman named Lydia Collins had lived there, and one night, she simply vanished without a trace. Her belongings were left untouched, her front door locked from the inside. The only clue was a chilling note scrawled on a piece of paper left on her bed, "Don't let them take me under." Katie's hands shook as she stared at the words on the screen. She felt a growing sense of dread, a fear that tightened around her like a vice. She knew then that the whispers weren't just her imagination, and that they were connected to Lydia's disappearance. That night, as Katie lay in bed, she didn't bother turning off the light. She knew the whisper would come, whether the room was dark or not. And it did, softer this time, almost like a sigh, a whisper from another world. "Help me," the voice said, barely audible. "Please, don't leave me down here." Katie's fear turned to determination. She grabbed her flashlight and, with a deep breath, slowly crouched down to look under the bed once more. This time she reached out, moving the boxes aside, her fingers trembling as she brushed against the cold floor. And then she saw it. A small, hollow space carved into the floorboards, just big enough for a hand to reach through. Her flashlight flickered, and for a split second she saw something else, fingers, pale and thin, gripping the edge of the hole. Katie's breath caught in her throat as a face emerged from the darkness beneath the bed. It was the face of a woman, gaunt, terrified, her eyes wide and pleading. Her lips cracked and dry as she mouthed the words, "Don't let them take me back." Katie screamed and scrambled away, her flashlight rolling across the floor. The woman's face, Lydia's face, twisted into an expression of horror, and then she was gone, sucked back into the darkness beneath the bed. Katie slammed her bedroom door shut and called the police, her voice shaking as she told them about the hidden space under the bed, about the face she had seen. They arrived within minutes, searching the apartment, pulling up floorboards, tearing apart the room. They found nothing. No hidden space, no evidence of anyone under the bed, just dust and old wood. The officer in charge gave her a sympathetic look, suggesting that maybe she'd experienced a vivid dream or sleep paralysis. But Katie knew the truth. She knew that Lydia Collins was still down there, trapped in a place that wasn't quite of this world. And whatever had taken her was still waiting, hiding in the shadows, whispering to her through the darkness. Katie moved out of the apartment the very next day, refusing to spend another night in that cursed place. But even in her new home, she couldn't escape the whispers. She would hear them in the dead of night, just as she was drifting off to sleep, a soft voice calling to her from beneath the bed. "Don't leave me," the whisper said. "I'm still here, waiting." And she knew then that no matter where she went, she would never truly escape the voice under the bed. It would always follow her, always whisper to her, always remind her that there are things in the dark that you can't just walk away from. Things that never stop watching. Things that never stop waiting.